This is a story about a magical world filled with a variety of monsters, from insidious goblins to unknown creatures. The goblins were as numerous as ants and attacked in a crowd, but there were those who had no trouble dealing with them, no matter how many there were. The goblins were cunning and always tried to outwit their opponents. However, one day they came across a young man against whom their tricks did not work. But the monsters did not give up, despite the fact that most of their comrades had already been killed. Even their sudden attacks with bows were of no avail. The brave warrior was Yuwan. At first glance, he looked like an ordinary boy, but his skill level was very high. Using Bang Bang, his strongest weapon that resembles a bat, he transformed it into something more. Now it was a real automatic rifle filled with magic. This is what happens when you underestimate your opponent based only on appearance. The young man was not always so strong, but from early childhood, he showed extraordinary abilities. At the age of 4, he could read books without difficulty, which delighted his parents. They were even more amazed that the boy began to read in the languages of countries that no one in the family had even heard of. Then grandfather ran into the room and announced that Yuwan had inherited a rich lineage of ancestors. Finally, he said, a child was born who would fulfill a long-standing family dream, return the Tower of Babel to the possession of their family. The rest of the family were skeptical, thinking that their grandfather was simply delirious in his old age. However, he was confident in his words and wanted to show something to Yuwan. He told the boy a story about a great ancestor of the Ban family who once performed a real miracle. Having the ability to understand each other, he led the people and built a tower that would never collapse, the very same Tower of Babel. The first thing that came to the young man's mind was wealth. Could it be that their ancestor was the owner of this legendary tower? But the grandfather explained that the ancestor was merely a master linguist, capable of translating and transforming any language, and that the family should not forget what a great man he was. He convinced Yuwan that once their family found the tower again, they would regain their former glory and power. These words lit a spark in the boy's eyes. When he was very young, Yuwan often listened to his grandfather's stories about his ancestors' adventures, and his grandfather hoped that the boy's extraordinary talent in languages would help him realize the family dream. However, Yuwan's abilities exceeded all expectations, and one day a miracle happened. Now Yuwan is just a high school applicant, but thanks to his academic performance, he expected to enter a prestigious university, namely, to the Faculty of Political Science and Diplomacy at the University of S. But he began to worry that the results of his admission were not announced for some time. Suddenly, something strange appeared on the laptop screen. Yuwan didn't understand what was happening. An unknown letter appeared before him, which was not easy to read. The text was distorted and written in a language that Yuwan had never seen before. It seemed to announce his admission to the best academy in the alternate reality and the acceptance of his documents. Yuwan didn't understand what kind of academy this was, since he definitely hadn't applied there. Meanwhile, a timer appeared on the screen, counting down the time until the practical assessment. The young man decided that this was probably some kind of trick by his sister, Ban Yumi. The distorted letter disappeared, and a message about successful enrollment appeared on the screen. Yuwan was so happy that he completely forgot about the strange letter, thinking it was nerves. But the countdown was already coming to an end. Yumi entered the room to see if he had been admitted, but when she opened the door, she found no one there. Meanwhile, Yuwan had already been teleported to the location where the practical assessment for candidates from the lower dimensions was taking place. Looking around, he realized that this was not a game at all. He had actually been summoned to the academy. His mission was to defeat the blind goblin and destroy the dungeon core. The young man did not understand what practical assessment was being discussed, since he had not submitted documents anywhere. But the test had already begun. Blind goblins came running at his cries, and the young man was terrified by their appearance. Since goblins were blind, they relied solely on hearing and smell to navigate. Yuwan realized that now was not the time to be confused. His life was in danger. Still, he didn't fully understand whether he really needed to fight the goblins to get out of here. My head hurt a little after the fall, and the surrounding environment only increased my fear. He began to think about how to defeat the two monsters in order to pass the exam. While he was trying to figure out what to do, he accidentally made a couple of extra sounds. This was a big mistake. One of the goblins immediately rushed at him. Yuwan realized his mistake and tried to remain as quiet as possible. The goblins continued to rummage around in search of prey, reacting to the slightest sound. The young man tried to remain calm, but accidentally hit the rocks and made noise again. A blind goblin immediately attacked him, and it seemed that the boy was finished. But at the last moment he managed to dodge the monster's blow. Although he managed to evade them, the goblins did not leave him alone and continued their search. Then he realized that, despite their blindness, their senses of hearing and smell were much sharper. Moreover, they hunted together, chasing down the victim, and no matter how well he hid, he would still be found sooner or later. If he doesn't want to die so stupidly, he needs to come up with something urgently. The only way out is to use their power against them. Yuwan picked up a few stones and threw them away from himself. As expected, the goblins immediately rushed towards the sound, deciding that the victim was running away. One of them, having reached the place, realized that these were just stones and was slightly surprised. Meanwhile, the young man picked up a larger stone and threw it straight at the monster. It would not have been possible to knock out, much less kill, the goblin in this way, but it made the monster even more aggressive. One of the goblins thought that the blow came from behind, turned around and immediately struck back, only it was not Yuwan who was there, but his comrade. The goblins didn't even realize that they were fighting each other, believing that they had prey in front of them. In the end, Yuwan managed to defeat them. Completely weakened, they fell to the floor, covering each other with their bodies. However, the young man noticed that one of the monsters continued to breathe, although it could not escape from under the body of its comrade. Therefore, Yuwan had to deal with him himself. Despite his fear, he managed to finish off the goblin, because if he hesitated and could not finish off even this dying creature, he would not be able to get out of the dungeon. After that, something strange started to happen around him. A distorted letter appeared in front of him, which spoke of the successful completion of the first stage. As a reward for his courage, Yuwan receives the power of the upper dimension. And now he also has access to the Babylonian Codex. The power of the Babylonian Code has been activated. It will now be transmitted through the ideograms of the language, that is, symbols that convey meaning through their form. Hieroglyphs are also registered. Unlike phonetic symbols, which represent sounds, these symbols convey a concept directly through their form. The common concept of the two goblins was removed, demon and life. Now the young man can extract and absorb the concepts of his opponents depending on their level. Yuwan's abilities are not limited to just knowing languages. He can now become stronger at the expense of those he defeats. He managed to absorb 0.2 demons. Since such concepts are not within the power of humans, it is recommended to store them in the Babylonian Codex and apply them to other objects. Yuwan now has a choice: save the concept for later or apply it immediately, for example on himself. The young man decided to try it on himself. He absorbed 0.4 life, after which he increased his life level to 10.4. His overall abilities and potential have improved significantly. By absorbing 0.2 flesh, Yuwan's strength increased to 10.2, making his body stronger and healthier. It wasn't just a feeling. His grip, his legs, his skin, and everything else had definitely strengthened. And all this is due to the fact that he absorbed the concepts of just two goblins with the help of removal and absorption. After this, their bodies disappeared, leaving behind only clubs. Since the act of applying the concepts worked on him, it would work on other objects, such as the Goblin's Club. Using the unlocked power, Yuwan quickly cleared out the blind goblin dungeon. He also found the dungeon core and destroyed it. At this point, his special practical test was completed, and the young man thought that he would finally be able to return home. However, the place where he was moved was not his home at all. It turned out to be the academy dormitory. Yuwan found himself in a world he had never seen before, a place called the Union Academy. After passing the exam, he received the status of a temporary student, but he was more interested in where he was. He received a letter asking him to put on the provided uniform and then come for an interview. Yuwan still didn't understand what was going on. He had just taken the entrance exams, and now he had to wear the school uniform again. The young man was unhappy with this turn of events. After all, he had just found himself on the brink of death, and now they wanted to interview him. And yet he agreed, intending to say everything he thought about it. At the very least, Yuwan planned to demand compensation for such impudence. But his indignation immediately vanished when he saw the professor, who seemed attractive to him at first sight. She had green skin and was clearly not human. Yuwan was surprised and thought she was an alien. She introduced herself as the professor of magical combat at the United Academy, Yuwan, and was glad to meet the young man. She also congratulated him on successfully passing the practical exam, adding that the entire faculty was watching him. Yuwan wasn't particularly happy about this news. Yuwan informed him that he was the first student in 500 years to create a new artifact during an exam. The young man did not share her delight. After all, he was transferred here without his knowledge. He did not understand anything and almost died. Maybe it's because they are from different worlds and have different ways of thinking. Yuwan didn't plan to stay here and planned to leave right after the interview. Or so he thought, until he saw something that made him change his mind. There was a huge column in front of him, and he asked the professor what it was called. Yuwan replied that she had heard that the people from the lower dimensions knew nothing about the unification and this pillar, and it turned out to be true. She then added that this pillar was the reason the academy was created. The academy is dedicated to nurturing students with outstanding talents from all dimensions and helping them reach the top of the tower. This is the aspiration of the United Academy and the last hope of all worlds. This was the very same Tower of Babel, a dungeon among dungeons, which is the source of all the secrets and dangers of this world. Yuwan was delighted. Could all the stories his grandfather told him when he was a child really be true? Everything he talked about was right here. However, Yumina warned that the tower was the dungeon of all dungeons and was likely already filled with monsters. But it didn't matter. Yuwan was determined to restore the family to its former glory. It was then that he decided to enroll in the United Academy. Thanks to the special treatment of the professors, he was temporarily sent back home. There, Yuwan gathered the whole family and told them what had happened. Grandfather was simply delighted, and the young man had the opportunity to prepare for admission. To do this, he went to the lower dungeon of the Union, to the Hobgoblin Cave. There his preparation began. He easily dealt with all the goblins that stood in his way. Finally, he managed to discover something new in himself. Before that, he only used his linguistic abilities. But now, everything had changed. Thanks to the Babylonian Codex, he could verbalize, absorb, and manipulate the concepts of objects. When defeating an enemy, Yuwan is able to recognize and master their concept. And the more concepts he collects, the stronger he becomes. The concept he had received in the first dungeon, from the blind goblins, he put into the club he had received. He strengthened it and turned it into a weapon, which now became his main weapon. This is no longer just a club, but the formidable bat, a mace imbued with ghostly energy, and the first artifact created by Yuwan. It is capable of revealing its true form at the owner's command, transforming and acting independently as an autonomous artifact. Due to the fact that he created this artifact by accident, he received a good result in the evaluation. Among the concepts obtained from the monsters, there was something that Yuwan had never encountered before: a soul. Suddenly the mace began to swing from side to side as if to say, "I want this." Along with the soul, Yuwan decided to convey a little more life, as well as the concepts of ghost and spirit. By acquiring even the most insignificant concepts, the young man used them to saturate the mace. He didn't fully understand what would happen when he passed these concepts on to her, but that only made things more interesting. The concepts, united in perfect harmony, caused the transformation of the artifact. The concepts of Ghost 2.5 and Beast 4 automatically merged. Their perfect synergy led to a fusion that goes beyond ordinary existence. Yuwan was surprised when he saw the Beast concept. Could it be that one of the concepts he left behind could transform on its own? Through transcendental fusion, the concept of Ghost Beast 10 inches was completed. By combining the symbols of a ghost and a beast, the young man obtained a ghost beast. Her personality remained the same, and the boy wondered if she could still transform into a magical cannon or shield. From now on, this ghostly beast would be called Eva, and before returning, Yuwan decided to check his characteristics. They had grown noticeably since last time. The flesh seemed to reflect physical characteristics, but Yuwan was more interested in why the soul stat was so high compared to the others. He also gained the abilities All-Seeing Eye, Perfect Pitch, and Mouth of Babel, which may have been related to his linguistic skills. It was also interesting to see if Eva would be able to surprise anyone, but it seemed she was sure of the opposite. It's time to leave the dungeon and return to the academy. Yuwan was steadily improving his stats. The main thing was not to lose momentum, and now the most important event was the entrance ceremony to the United Academy. The ceremony was to take place in a special auditorium at the academy, designated exclusively for admissions. Other students gradually filled the hall, taking their seats while they waited for it to begin. Yuwan's sudden appearance surprised the students standing nearby. Yuwan himself was also amazed to see how many people came to the ceremony. He activated the All-Seeing Eyes, which allowed him to read aura and spirit, and the higher their level became, the deeper the owner could understand the surroundings. As the young man had expected, unlike him, who had passed through a special quota for the lower dimensions, the regular students who passed the regular selection looked very strong, even at first glance. While Yuwan was looking around for a place, a couple of students had already approached him. This was the type of person who belittles others because of their origin. In his case, because of their belonging to a lower dimension. Yuwan didn't want any trouble, so he decided to quickly move away. As he thought, those who passed the regular selection had a very high opinion of themselves. Even here, the powerful and influential students looked down on those below them. Suddenly, someone called out Yuwan's name and said that the special selection students were in another place. The phrase special selection students sounded respectable but felt more like isolation. Yuwan was surprised that all these guys were actually from the lower dimensions, just like him. However, their characteristics and abilities were far superior to his own. Each of them was not just taller than him, but surpassed him by several heads. Compared to them, only Yuwan truly looked like a representative of the lower dimensions. They were at such a level that they could single-handedly deal with the regular selection students. Among them was Enslave, his roommate, who really did look like he was studying light. Enslave was surprised when Yuwan called their place amazing. They had already met in the dorm before Yuwan came to the ceremony, and their first meeting was a little awkward. At first, Enslave mistook him for an enemy, not realizing that he was facing a freshman and his neighbor. He immediately apologized, citing nerves after the practical exam. At first glance, Enslave looked like a prince from a fairy tale, but he turned out to be quite hot-tempered. Yuwan told him about his exam, which amused him greatly. After all, even a beginner familiar with only the basics could have dealt with the goblins. Enslave himself had to deal with a group of trolls and ogres. Yuwan noted that he hadn't talked to anyone so casually in a long time. After all, they met right after the exam, without even having time to take a shower. Therefore, the young man wanted to go to the shower as soon as possible. Even though the shower was shared, Enslave still decided to continue the conversation right there. Yuwan seemed to have a slight feeling of awkwardness after this meeting. And since these seats were set aside specifically for special selection students, it meant that the two girls sitting next to Enslave were also from his group. Yuwan greeted them. One of the girls looked like the embodiment of kindness and sweetness. Her name was Rushel. The second one was more reserved, and the first thing that caught her interest was the snake wrapped around Yuwan's arm. Even though Eva was invisible, she was able to see it. Yuwan introduced Eva to his new acquaintances. They were surprised when they saw her, but the young man was still wondering how they managed to do it. Enslave wondered if this was the same artifact he had before, and how he was able to change it so quickly in just a couple of days. Despite the cool reception, the girl became interested in Yuwan and introduced herself as Doyan, the daughter of Master Murim. Yuwan also introduced himself and asked her about Master Murim. It turns out that she uses martial arts and creates gusts of wind between her palms. The young man was too straightforward in his statements, which slightly amused the others. Doyan replied that he was absolutely right, she really does that. In the distance, Yuwan also noticed Yumina sitting among the other professors. Enslave asked if he really had an interview with the professor. Yuwan said yes, and for some reason he thought Enslave had too. But suddenly something began to happen above them. The ceiling of the auditorium gradually opened up. Some strange pressure appeared, which caused the students' heads to hurt. None of them could withstand this incomprehensible pressure. At this time, a voice was heard that announced the readiness for the ceremony. Yuwan looked up and saw something strange that shocked him. It was like a huge eye that announced the beginning of the 2557th opening ceremony of the United Academy. After the ceremony, Yuwan and the others gathered in Yumina's office. She wondered if the students were impressed by the principal's speech. But for most students, this caused more fear than pleasant surprise. Yuwan replied that it was unbelievable and asked if that giant eye was the principal. His words shocked everyone, as many were too scared to even look up. Doyan looked at Yuwan with apprehension after that. It seemed to her that he was not a student at all, but some kind of creature hidden under a special ability. But Yuwan continued that, at least it felt like a huge eye was looking at them. Yumina confirmed that it was indeed the rector, and they would most likely not see him again unless they achieved something exceptional or provoked an incident. However, it seemed that Yuwan would have a personal meeting with the principal, although for him it was more like a curse. Yumina added that the students' achievements were also her achievements as a professor. These words surprised Enslave. He asked Yumina if she would be their leader, to which she replied in the affirmative. Enslave was surprised because they would be led by one of only 9 professors in the entire academy. The professor formally introduced herself as Yumina and explained that she taught magical combat. Enslave asked if students weren't usually assigned lower-level mentors. Yumina replied that it was, but that this year the students admitted were so unusual that the responsibility was placed on her. So unusual, it's a wonder they were chosen at all. The professor warned them to be careful of jealousy and hostility from regular students. Yuwan was surprised by her words because the envy and hostility here went beyond ordinary rivalry. We were talking about real clashes and fights in which even professors have no right to interfere. Yumina added that from now on, the 4 of them must stick together since they are rare special selection students. To thrive among others, they must be strong enough to ignore others' envy and hostility. And with that, they are now partners who will have to climb the tower until the end of their training. Yumina then thanked them and informed them that the academy had prepared small gifts for them. She will explain the rules and other details after they receive the artifacts. The artifact was so bright that it was impossible to look away. This pendant was a kind of student ID card that students were required to carry with them. With its help, they could identify themselves, gain access to all campus facilities, and even teleport around the territory of the association. The teleportation spell actually worked, and Enslave and Rushel were delighted with the professor. Doyan, on the contrary, did not show such emotionality. The ticket was also needed to enter the tower, so the pendant had to be carefully looked after. Rushel was curious as to why the others left while Yuwan stayed. Doyan guessed that it might be because he was the only one who sensed the presence of the eye. Just before the tea party, Yumina received a call about this. Doyan immediately realized that something was wrong because only Yuwan was able to look directly at the principal. Meanwhile, Yuwan sat in the office, overcome with excitement. A personal meeting with the rector on the very first day. What did he manage to do? Suddenly, a voice began to come from the doll standing opposite. He said that the young man could look at him calmly because his true incarnation was not here. The rector asked to be called master and explained why he had summoned the young man. He usually does not interfere with the student's education. The weak remain weak, the strong remain strong. Their lives depend only on them. Whether they die in the tower or achieve power and glory, the master does not care. Yuwan tensed up as he listened to the rector's monologue and didn't quite understand what he was talking about. The master explained that he had only one goal, to see who could reach the top. Everything else was of no importance to him. He spoke of the Tower of Babel, which the Ban family has been intending to reclaim since ancient times, along with all its power and glory. But Yuwan is willing to risk his life to get the tower back. However, the master reminded him that the tower had different meanings for the other students, and each one had his own way of trying to get to the top. So the young man asked the master what the tower was. He replied that the tower was a test on the path to the divine. Hearing this, Yuwan began to worry. What kind of deity was on top of it? By deity, he meant something like glory and dictatorship, where everyone bows down to one master. Yuwan was excited, but he was even more curious about what was hidden at the top of the tower. The master continued that he usually did not interfere with the students' difficulties, but this time, he would make an exception. Because he saw potential in the young man, the greatest he had ever seen. He promised to take measures to help Yuwan climb to the top of the tower. Something strange began to happen to the young man's pendant, and it frightened him. But the master reassured him, saying that everything was fine. He had simply expanded his rights to research outside the academy. Now he could go to any dungeon. Yuwan now has even more opportunities to hone his skills before climbing the tower. The master thanked the young student and sent him away, wishing him good luck. He added that the boy needs to improve his skills, and if his progress is noticeable, he will unlock the next privilege for him. Yuwan wasn't quite sure what kind of privilege he was talking about. The master explained that he would allow him to explore the tower alone. Yuwan was surprised to hear this. Finally, he added that he would look forward to their next meeting. Emerging from the portal, he accidentally bumped into the professor. She just smiled and said that everything was fine. The rector always let guests go this way. Yuwan told her about the conversation. The professor was surprised to learn that the master had given him permission to leave the academy. The young student did not understand whether this was really so important, to which the professor replied that not everyone is allowed to do this. Now he could freely explore the outer dungeons and visit the outer cities at will. This meant that he would receive much more experience and training than other students. Yuwan thought that the master gave him this opportunity because he considered him too weak, so the privilege was akin to extra classes. Yumina even envied Yuwan a little, because professors are usually so busy that they can't leave the academy at this time. She added that the association is an academy where everything is arranged in the interests of students, which is sometimes inconvenient for teachers. He could wander around the shops and enjoy the local delicacies as much as he wanted. Yumina advised him of one good outer city, Ronica. So the young man went there. The professor asked him to bring 2 bottles of wine for the newlyweds, made by the priests of the temple. The drink was famous for its sweet, fruity aroma, rich bubbles, and long aftertaste. Yuwan couldn't refuse her, and he himself wasn't against it, because there was certainly something interesting to be found in the city. In addition, as a reward for this, he received an expanded inventory. Yuwan remembered one of the items his grandfather left him before he entered college. The young man became interested in what kind of consumables his grandfather had prepared for him. He gave the bag to me just before leaving, saying that it contained something he would soon need. The bag was so heavy that it felt like it contained bricks rather than anything useful, and it turned out to be close to the truth. Inside were bars of pure gold. Grandfather said that the young man could take as much as he wanted. After all, this was the legacy of his ancestors who had dedicated themselves to finding the Tower of Babel. Now, it all belonged to him. Thanks to the inventory, carrying them with you was not difficult. The grandfather also reminded that gold is valuable in any world, and the time had come for the young man to go to a new world. The city of Ronica really looked amazing. Even though it was another dimension, the cityscape seemed familiar. While Yuwan was admiring the streets, guards approached him and asked where he was from, since they had never seen him there before. As they got closer, they noticed he was wearing a student uniform and realized he was from the United Academy. They greeted him warmly and introduced themselves as guards of the western border of the Ronica academic town. They were curious whether the rector himself had given him permission. Yuwan confirmed that this was indeed the case. The master had allowed him to freely explore the area. They added that thanks to the hard work of the master and the academy staff, their city still remains peaceful, and they are grateful for that. The guards offered their help if the young man wanted to get used to the city. Without thinking twice, Yuwan raised his hand, pointed at one of the flying machines, and said that he would like to get his hands on one. He wondered how much it was worth, although it wasn't that important. His ancestors had left him enough money. Thanks to his inheritance, it was not difficult for him to acquire a hoverbike. Emotions were off the charts. The young man had not been able to be so happy for a long time. Even the basic version of the bike cost 250,000 roni, expensive, but not for Yuwan. The guards were surprised when the young man took out a gold bar and offered to exchange it for a hoverbike. The exchange was far from equal. 1 gold bar was worth 7.5 million roni. All this time Eva was with him, and she, apparently, was also interested in flying on a bike. Yuwan added the concept of spirit and ghost to it, turning the hoverbike into a living artifact. The young man named the new artifact Lilith, endowing it with a will, just like Eve. He also bought some wine for the professor, so it was time to return to the academy. But the joy did not last long. The professor invited him to have a drink together. Enslave was disappointed in Yuwan because after their meeting, he left without saying a word. In addition, Yuwan came back with a hangover, which made Enslave even more angry. The young man admitted that he was truly sorry, but he could not refuse the professor. Also, Yuwan is now the class representative. Doyan joked that he got the symbol of the representative in exchange for becoming the professor's drinking buddy. But the young man was not against this either. Enslave, although with displeasure, accepted it. Doyan was against this decision and believed that she should be the headman, because she is the strongest among them. Doyan was confident that she was stronger than even Yuwan. Enslave was dissatisfied with Doyan's words and thought they were a strange way to express thoughts. After all, they should be equal comrades. He wanted to hear an explanation from her, because her attitude as if she was above everyone else was unlikely to have a good effect on their joint adventures in the tower. But Doyan didn't agree with Enslave. In fact, she was even amused by it. It was funny for her to hear about equal comrades from the one who asked the professor yesterday whether students could conquer the tower alone. Enslave replied that he was just curious. It didn't mean he didn't want to go to the tower with the others. It looks like they're getting into that hostility thing. And in the morning, Yuwan was going to say that they should at least come up with a plan in advance. But it looks like the group is already off to a rough start. In particular, Yuwan didn't want to be the class president. But now he began to understand why Yumina chose him out of the 4 of them. Enslave is surprisingly ignorant, but his pride is ridiculously strong. Doyan is incredibly self-centered, strong, but will definitely make enemies. And Rushel is surprisingly passive. She doesn't have the character to lead or educate others. Therefore, Yuwan was the best candidate among the others. And since he's the class president, it's time to take matters into his own hands. Yuwan says that the class president doesn't have to be the strongest, because he's responsible for other things. But Doyan did not agree with his words. In her opinion, the headman should still be the strongest. Yuwan believes that since the strongest is the class president, he will make all decisions independently at his own discretion. The class president must be able to offer a fair and good solution for everyone. In this sense, he is the most flexible. Doyan still decided to back down, since it was the professor who had the right to appoint the class monitor, as long as she agreed with their arguments. Although the only person she wanted to lead was Yuwan, these words made the young man tense. Doyan added that even if something is bothering her, if she wants to get what she wants, she will have to put up with what she doesn't need. By doing this, she further fueled the internal conflict in the class. Doyan left, and her last words deeply hurt Enslave. The morning was indeed difficult. Yuwan felt like he was on a battlefield rather than at the university. It will take a long time to solve the pride problem, but in the meantime, we need to come up with a new plan. The only one who didn't care about all this was Rushel. All she wanted was to pet Eva, Yuwan's living artifact. This place is full of secrets, and Yuwan's first lesson as the class president of the 11th grade, filled with unique personalities, was full of surprises. And it was quite difficult because the lesson began with significant difficulties. The first lesson will be a light sparring match between 2 classes. The class of special students was clearly outnumbered by the other class, and besides the numbers, they were even inferior in abilities. The teacher asked the students to choose an opponent with whom they would like to spar. The students from the other class wanted to deal with the special students as soon as possible, each of them eager to fight first. But Yuwan's class didn't have the same enthusiasm. On the contrary, they didn't understand their zeal. Enslave assumed that since the academy divided the classes based on the students' abilities, the first special class hated the 11th. Moreover, Yuwan was wearing the headman's symbol, which further provoked the opponents. One of the opponents considered it impudent to wear Professor Yumina's brooch and did not agree with it. That's why he, more than anyone else, wanted to deal with them. Meanwhile, Professor Yumina didn't understand why her students were assigned a joint meeting with the special class on the very first day. Besides, practice in real combat is not at all like a specially selected student from the lower dimension being able to hold his own in a sparring match with someone from the upper class. It was probably a prank that someone had intended when they made the schedule, but the professor still felt some kind of evil intent. The first sparring match will be between Yuwan and Erecto, but the youth replied that he cannot, as his fighting skills are still insufficient. For this, the teacher immediately took 3 points away from their team and said that this was not an excuse, so the fight would take place. Yuwan didn't understand why the teacher was dragging him into sparring. Was it really to humiliate him in front of everyone? The young man added that he was accepted as a specially selected student because of his unique abilities, not his fighting skills, so it would be more logical to evaluate him differently. After Yuwan's words, the teacher became angry. It was unacceptable for him that some student would teach him, and for this, he took away another 5 points. Yuwan said he was willing to spar, but only if he had a week to prepare, then he would be willing to compete. According to the young man, within a week, he will be able to enter the upper dimension and return from there stronger. After such a speech, everyone present in the arena fell silent, but not from delight, but rather from the stupidity of what they heard. The students understood that in a week he would be able to prepare for a sparring match against Erecto. Yet among them, there were those who were intrigued by Yuwan's words. After all, the young man says that he can confidently confront someone from the special class with just a week of preparation. The teacher was not particularly happy with his proposal because he again ignored it and set his own conditions. And yet he agreed to it. Next Tuesday, there will be an official sparring match between 2 students, Yuwan and Erecto. The format will be completely open, and the entire academy will have the opportunity to watch the broadcast live. The teacher also added that since it was Yuwan who asked for the preparatory period, it would be better for him to show his full abilities. Yuwan replied that he would show everything he could and was also looking forward to the match with Erecto. But Erecto irritated him more because it was quite difficult to see a worthy opponent in the boy. Yuwan also managed to find out the opponent's characteristics using the same all-seeing eyes. Literally everyone's stats were superior to Yuwan's, even including his friends. As he approached them, he noticed that they looked very uneasy. He wondered if it was because of him, but they were more worried about Doyan, who was already warming up and was ready to fight against anyone. Unlike the headman, she specializes in battles. Doyan looked confident because she knew that she had characteristics superior to most, if not all, of those present, so she was ready to fight against anyone. But looking at her, the other students completely lost their desire to fight. And it wasn't strange because even Yuwan, with his own eyes, couldn't fully comprehend the extent of Doyan's strength. It was simply impossible for the students from the first class not to sense her overwhelming aura. She didn't understand what was going on. Should she really back down because of their lack of confidence? So she decided to challenge Erecto to a sparring match, since he was the noisiest of them all. Doyan was more than confident that he would agree to go against her, and she would easily defeat him. Erecto's original target was Yuwan, so he didn't want to fight anyone else, much less Doyan. If he falls for Doyan's provocation, she will really beat him up and he will be so injured that he won't recover within a week. Not that Yuwan cared. He didn't care. He wanted it to happen, so he decided to try to stop Doyan. Yuwan said that Erecto already had a sparring match scheduled with him, so if she wanted to fight, she should wait her turn. He is, of course, grateful that she stood up for him, but he will still be able to defeat Erecto himself. After all, he must prove that he is worth something with his own efforts. Doyan thought that Yuwan was just a guy who relied on various tricks, but it turns out that he has a bit of manliness, so she doesn't mind. Erecto didn't even have time to say a word before everything was already decided for him. Meanwhile, Doyan's desire to compete with someone did not subside, so she asked again if there was anyone willing to fight her. But as expected, there was only silence in response. No one wanted to even try to resist her. Doyan was disappointed because just a couple of minutes ago they were so noisy and wanted to compete. But as soon as someone stronger came out, their barking immediately died down. She literally called them dogs, and one of the students was not happy with such loud statements. He added that the weak and stupid always unite in packs, growl, pretend to protect their small groups. Therefore, such a spectacle simply cannot fail to please. Even though he was a special class student, his aura was different from the others. He was like a bird of a completely different feather. S-Light noted that this guy's name is Ortima, and he is the ruler of the dimension of Kedius. It's not that Yuwan hadn't heard of Ortim, he didn't even know such a dimension existed. S-Light added that in addition to the Union, there are 10 upper dimensions. Ortima is from the family that rules one of them, Kedius. So he is one of the top 10 families among all dimensions. Before the sparring began, Ortima asked the teacher to turn on the recording device to record their sparring. Yuwan didn't understand why he was doing this, but S-Light replied that it was necessary so that he could later show the video on the intranet. Yuwan replied that he knew that an intranet was a network created by educational institutions to exchange information. S-Light was surprised when the young man told him this, because he came from the lower dimension and did not even know about the unification. So how did he know about the intranet? Meanwhile, the students found a live broadcast of Doyan and Ortima sparring. Now everyone, including students of the academy, will be able to see their fight. For some reason, the teacher wants to put specially selected students in an awkward position, but he is unlikely to succeed. The aura of the two opponents was simply off the charts. It didn't seem like Doyan was inferior to Ortima in strength. Doyan was even willing to let him make the first move, calling him a newbie. Ortima was surprised when she called him a newbie, so he wanted to show that he was an experienced warrior. He used a technique that could distort nature and put pressure on the opponent. It was the first time Yuwan had experienced something similar, so he didn't immediately understand the essence of his technique. His power was significantly different from the one Yuwan controlled. like water flowing from top to bottom. Plus, the air got heavier and it became hard to breathe. It felt like everything around was shrinking and collapsing from within. It makes you fall to your knees, as if it were the most natural thing a young man could do. Yuwan realized that his technique was a distortion of the laws of nature. Enslave was surprised when he learned that Yuwan had just figured out how his ability worked. Meanwhile, Russell was feeling uneasy and was very scared and trying to hide behind Yuwan. But it wasn't Ortima's technique that scared her, but the power that Doyan possessed. She simply increased her energy without any effort. In this way, she was able to completely suppress the opponent's energy as if nothing had happened. Yuwan was delighted. He knew that Doyan was strong not just by words, but to be so. Ortima was also pleasantly surprised by his rival's abilities. It seemed that she was really capable of something as he thought. Doyan wasn't thrilled. For her, such a technique was weak. She called his strength as ridiculous as his horns. But Ortima's attack did not end there, and he planned to attack again, but Doyan no longer stood aside. With incredible speed, she suddenly attacked her opponent and was quite successful. Ortima didn't expect such a quick attack from Doyan. She, in turn, did not want to let him attack twice because he had too obvious an attack, which became stronger the closer he was. Ortima's confidence gradually faded, and he decided to fight seriously, using both hands. But Doyan seemed to be one step ahead, or to be more precise, already behind his back. Ortima tried to attack her, but the girl's agility allowed her to easily dodge, and then strike the enemy. She called his movements stiff and clumsy. Doyan was disappointed because she thought Ortima would be much stronger. Ortim was even more angered by his rival's words about him being weak and clumsy. Enslave was delighted to see Doyan easily dominating Ortima. She literally crushed him, leaving no chance for victory. Yuwan noted that Ortima looked like he was simply used to suppressing his opponent's actions. He was not used to fighting, contenting himself with only the technique of distorting the laws of nature. And when an opponent like Doyan appeared before him, who was able to suppress his technique and then attack in close combat, he became vulnerable. Sparring with Doyan proves that his method doesn't always work. Of course, Ortima had talent and potential, you can't call him weak. He had the power of suppression and physical abilities, but he himself did not move. Enslave was surprised at how Yuwan noticed all this. Doyan, who fights on par with Ortima, and Yuwan, who at this time comprehends them in both. They are truly special selection students from the lower dimensions. It was hard to follow the sparring. Only one thing was clear. Doyan was showing the lead. Ortima could only defend himself from her attacks. For him, it was more like an insult, and this angered him even more. But Doyan did not lose her momentum and continued to attack her opponent. Suddenly, Ortima finally dared to counterattack her. He was beside himself with anger and was not going to tolerate any more humiliation from her. Now he not only wants to defeat her, but even more, to kill her. But Doyan only replied that the concept of death was not something a child like him should talk about. Now this is not just a sparring match to assess abilities, but a real battle to the death. It seemed that one of the students would strike so hard that he would kill his opponent. But luckily, at that moment, Professor Yuwan appeared and stopped their sparring. Her technique was like slowing down time. Suddenly, everything around stopped. Flowers appeared on the arena, as if she had transported them to a flower meadow. Yuwan also noted that the academy does not encourage students to fight to the death. Therefore, she would prefer that her strength be spent on passing the tower. The entire arena looked like a field filled with flowers, and bright and beautiful petals were falling from the sky. The spectacle was extraordinarily beautiful and outstanding. It was a real stroke of luck to see something like this. Yuwan thought it was just an illusion, but for an illusion, the scent of the flowers was too strong. The students, of course, were not happy with the professor's intervention and still could not decide which of them was stronger. Ortima didn't say anything and decided to just turn around and leave. Doyan was also surprised at how strong Professor Yuwan actually was. Returning to her friends, she asked them what it looked like from the outside. Yuwan replied that it was truly amazing. At this time, Russell crashed into Yuwan's back while hiding from Doyan. While others admired her strength, she was still afraid. Yuwan found something cute in her actions, while Doyan found it more irritating. Meanwhile, the professor scolded Teacher Farrell for deciding to pit students against each other in sparring from the very first lesson. Such actions are not acceptable in the academy, so he will be punished. The teacher apologized and said that he realized his mistake, but the professor only replied that a simple apology would not get him off. As she approached the students in her class, she also noticed that Yuwan had an upside-down badge. Yuwan said that for a class leader, dignity is everything, so you shouldn't wear the badge like that. It seemed that all the conflicts between the students had died down, but with her actions, the professor created another one. After this, the other students began to hate Yuwan even more. Meanwhile, the entire internet was discussing Doyan and Ortima's sparring match. Everyone was delighted that the girl from the lower dimension was able to fight equally with the ruler of Katius. The incident with Yuwan and the professor also did not go unnoticed. After that, the young man began to have significantly more ill-wishers. The entire internet was discussing what happened that day. Doyan didn't use social media much, so this all seemed strange to her. She was also surprised that many people consider Ortima to be promising. She is sure of the opposite. Then in the arena she noticed someone more capable than him. Doyan asked if Yuwan had seen her, but he replied that he had not, as he was focused on her sparring. The guys weren't familiar with internet slang either. Enslave, of course, tried to understand what was being written about them, but it was difficult. Everyone was talking about nothing but Yuwan and Doyan's sparring. And speaking of everyone, Enslave noticed something odd. Had Russell always sat so far away from them? Had something happened? She looked scared of Doyan and couldn't even get close to her. Yuwan couldn't imagine them sharing a room. Maybe she's just nervous after sparring. So Yuwan, as a class leader and as a friend, decided to cheer everyone up by taking out some jam from his inventory. It was a concentrate of 1,000 fruits, a special jam elixir that he managed to create. In addition to the amazing taste, it helps to increase the characteristics. Looking at the jar of jam, Enslave and Doyan were surprised and did not quite understand what was going on. Yuwan opened the jar and asked for some bread. The aroma of the jam was so outstanding that it even reached Russell, who was sitting on the edge of the table. Yuwan spread jam on the bread, and it shone like molten gold. The taste was so sweet that it was impossible to describe in words. The young man was glad that his friends liked the jam he made himself. The taste was incredible. Doyan added that she had tried all the delicious things from the Central Plains, but this was on a whole other level. Russell also wanted to try, but due to fear of Doyan, she couldn't join. Still, she managed to overcome her fear and try the bread with fruit jam. As she expected, the taste was amazing. It was something completely new to her. It was so delicious that Doyan asked Yuwan to make another one of these concentrates. He, of course, didn't mind. According to friends, the taste felt like something precious, but Yuwan said that it wasn't exactly like that. It wasn't that expensive, but since they were a team, it was nice to share something good. So this can be considered as gratitude for the kindness they showed him earlier. Doyan decided that in exchange for the elixir, she would teach him martial arts. She will teach him all the basics and other skills he needs, so that Yuwan can fight back against Erecto. They moved together to the training field to begin their martial arts training. There was enough space to move freely. Before Yuwan could even finish eating, Doyan teleported him to the training room. He was curious about what she was going to teach him. But Doyan ignored him and immediately began teaching him. The first thing he needed to learn was not to make any sudden movements. The movements should be smooth and with maximum concentration, so the first technique will not be difficult. Before Yuwan could blink, the Doyan sword appeared before his eyes. He was surprised by her speed and skills. If this was a real fight, he would not be alive. Doyan called it stab. This would be Yuwan's first mastered strike. This movement, carried out without the slightest hesitation or doubt, made it hard to believe that this stabbing attack was made by a living being. However, Yuwan managed to notice something in such a short moment. It was this new concept of piercing that Doyan used to perform this attack. Yuwan didn't understand why it was called piercing. Wasn't it closer to fencing? He was so caught up in his thoughts that he didn't hear what Doyan was telling him. She continued that a thrust does not exist on its own, outside of a combination, and can be the end result of anything, but it doesn't matter. What she shows him is the most basic and fundamental essence of a thrust. His skill in using it depends on how often he stabs. It is also important from where he delivers the thrust. It is important to think about what he is trying to imitate when he stabs the enemy. And finally, what is the intention behind this blow? Doyan noted that these are the basic principles of thrusting. There are also countless variations, but the basics remain the same. Yuwan was in awe of Doyan's martial arts skills. He did a little analysis of Doyan's actions, who had mastered one concept to perfection that was felt much deeper than several concepts mixed together. Now it was Yuwan's turn to try a stabbing attack. Yuwan warned her that of course it would be a pathetic parody, but he would still try. Doyan replied that if he could copy her movements perfectly the first time, it would mean that all the years she spent honing the skill of this strike would be meaningless. Yuwan tried to perform a kick, and it was very similar to what Doyan showed. She was delighted to see that he had managed to master the essence after seeing her move just once. But Yuwan thought that this was not it. He needed to focus more to repeat the strike. Before this, he had been too focused on combining concepts and thought that it was enough to strengthen them simply by combining them or adding new ones. But that's not all. His strength can increase even more by improving what he has already mastered. Yuwan was faced with the question, if there were many symbols for stabbing, why did he choose piercing? He used it because to her, stabbing means to pierce the target without fail. The goal is to quickly and powerfully pierce the enemy, inflicting a fatal blow. The more Yuwan delved into it, the more he was able to replicate Doyan's strike. She was delighted with the speed with which the young man was learning. Still, there's no point in exhausting yourself from the very beginning, so we can finish for today. Doyan advised him to use the attack when there was more space and against an enemy he could defeat. Through Doyan's training, Yuwan discovered new characteristics and improved old ones. He was surprised that he could increase his stats just by swinging his sword a few times. He grasped the concept of martial arts, piercing, and fencing. At first, Yuwan thought that he had only improved his stats a little. His stats had skyrocketed, and he had just learned the concept of pierce, and it was already at level 16. In addition, his swordsmanship, which had not increased at all no matter how many goblins he destroyed, had increased to 20. The young man's fighting skills doubled, an amazing result. Doyan didn't expect him to master the essence of the strike so easily. She didn't even think that Yuwan would be able to demonstrate the essence of the technique, even with a practice sword. He replied that he was simply repeating after her, but Doyan countered that if that were the case, why couldn't everyone master the kick like him? Yuwan added that maybe it's because she's a good teacher. After all, when he first saw the stabbing blow, he was able to feel the full depth of her movements. Yuwan was surprised that anyone could even achieve such a level of skill. This embarrassed Doyan, and she didn't understand how he could say such embarrassing things when they didn't know each other well enough yet. In any case, Yuwan was sincerely grateful to Doyan for the lesson and truly enjoyed learning from her. She could keep his elixir for herself. To which Doyan replied that it was hardly worth the time she spent studying. Yuwan didn't know what to do in such a case, how to compensate for her time. But Doyan replied that it was okay in that he would compensate her for her loss in time. It was the first time that Yuwan saw her smile so sincerely. From the first meeting, he considered her cold and unapproachable, but the more he got to know her, the friendlier she became. The training was over, and it was time to return to the academy. Meanwhile, things were not boring at the academy either. One event followed another. Since Russell was very attractive and sweet, many guys tried to get to know her. And basically their methods were to demonstrate their strength in front of her, thereby allegedly showing their masculinity. Of course, Russell didn't want to meet anyone, so she tried to refuse in any way possible. But fortunately, at that moment Enslave was next to her, who did not let her be harmed. He stood up for her and said that if anyone needed anything from her, they should tell him. In response, he called him a non-entity from the lower dimension, and these words made Enslave even more angry. Just at this time, Doyan and Yuwan returned from training. Doyan noted that they were just in time. Everything was just beginning, and Yuwan suggested that his friends go somewhere. The ill-wishers decided to retreat, but only now, promising to return. Yuwan asked Enslave what happened, but there was only silence in response. The troubles didn't end there. Those guys were also present at the history lesson, and they continued to follow Russell, ignoring comments and requests not to do this. Teachers also turned a blind eye to their inappropriate behavior. For Russell, this put a lot of pressure on her and interfered greatly not only with her studies, but also with her life. Yuwan and Enslave couldn't just stand by and watch their friend get bullied, so they started to come up with a plan. Regardless of the place, be it a lesson or another place, they continued to harass the girl. The professor ignored the three, but Enslave decided to intervene and inform him about it. Enslave said that some students were making a lot of noise and were preventing him from concentrating on the lecture. Could he please intervene? But the professor ignored him, replying that students should not talk during the lecture so as not to lose focus. Enslave and Yuwan were surprised by the professor's decision, because he is the one who should fight for justice and the safety of the students at the academy. But everything turns out the opposite. The trio continued to pester the boys, but now their focus was on Enslave. Even then, they didn't like him when he stood up for Russell, and after that, he became their enemy number one. They didn't understand why he was trying so hard. Maybe they were dating, so he was standing up for her. Enslave could no longer tolerate the nonsense of ill-wishers and was ready to start a fight right during the lesson. But Yuwan asked him to calm down and think about the situation calmly. Enslave didn't understand why Yuwan was telling him to back off when it was their classmate, but Yuwan argued that there was no point in getting involved in stupid things. Making trouble in class will only make things worse, so another plan is needed. For example, you can use the internet. The professor broadcasts his lecture on YouTube so that other students can listen to it too. But the camera was positioned so that the three of them were not visible. So Yuwan wanted to move the camera closer to them so that not only could they be seen, but their conversations could also be heard. Now everything they say can be seen and heard live. All thanks to Ava, who held the camera and was practically invisible. Meanwhile, the comments were not long in coming. Viewers began to condemn those guys and ask what the professor was doing at this time. Yuwan also named the broadcast Unification Story to attract more attention. Russell was grateful to her friends, but was still worried that this might cause trouble. And suddenly, three guys noticed this broadcast and immediately started looking for the camera. They started looking for the camera and the one who started the broadcast. After some time, they finally managed to find Ava, who was holding the camera. They started shouting to the whole audience that it was all Enslave and that it was his snake. And then the professor intervened. The professor was extremely unhappy with the students disrupting his lecture and ordered them to state their name and class and then leave the room. They tried to justify themselves to him somehow, but the professor was so angry that he simply kicked them out of the classroom. His anger knew no bounds. He promised to give them bad grades until the end of the year, and once again reminded the students not to disturb the order in the classroom and to listen carefully. Yuwan and Enslave weren't happy with the teacher's decision, because those guys said so much about Russell, and in the end, all they got was 2s. But Russell convinced the guys that everything was fine. That was enough. She was extremely grateful to her classmates for not leaving her in trouble. This made Yuwan a little embarrassed, and he replied that he just wanted to help. There was no need to thank him. Russell was glad that she finally had such good friends. Enslave was also glad that Russell was okay now, and added that he was still glad that Yuwan was the headman. Doyan was of the same opinion as the rest of the boys. However, the group's main troubles did not end there. They crossed paths again during the next lesson, and now the trio looked even more vicious. The boys thought they were finally finished, but it turned out that it wasn't so. But this time their target was not the seemingly defenseless Russell. Now their target was Enslave, whom they wanted to take revenge on for the moment with the camera, thinking that it was him. They were waiting for him to explain what happened yesterday in class. After all, it was because of that broadcast that their grades for the semester were ruined from the very beginning. Moreover, because of this incident, they are now avoided by other classmates. But what was more annoying was that the teacher didn't try to intervene in this situation, as if he didn't even notice them. It seems that the faculty really doesn't consider students from the lower dimensions to be human. The situation escalated, and it seemed that a fight was about to start. But Enslave did not want to continue the dialogue with them in such a tone. He explained to them that if they wanted to talk to him, they should ask him more politely and not like savages. This made them angry. They were ready to fight, despite the presence of the teacher. This answer angered them even more. They could not tolerate a conversation in such a tone from a person from the lower dimension. But Enslave couldn't stand it and pulled out his sword, knocking the enemy's sword out of his hands. The conflict escalated even more, and Yuwan and the rest of his classmates were surprised by this outcome. Yuwan's surprise knew no bounds. Using his eyes, he also noticed that Enslave had used a new concept. Enslave lost his composure and was furious with his ill-wishers. Out of fear, one of them pulled out a blade, but compared to Enslave's sword, it looked ridiculous. Enslave repeated to them once again that he would only speak to them if they asked him politely. Enslave, who usually looked like a whiny young man, suddenly looked like a brave knight. Yuwan was also surprised at how Enslave suddenly changed completely. He didn't believe that such a thing was possible. Maybe it's because of his sword. Maybe his sword has some strange concepts. Enslave applied such strong pressure that the opponent could not even move. Doyan also found his sudden change in behavior strange. Meanwhile, Enslave asked the teacher what grade a group that suddenly attacks their classmates with real swords during class gets at the academy. To which the teacher replied that the academy does not encourage outside sparring, so there could be punishment for this. Enslave didn't agree to sparring, so the incident can be considered an attack. The teacher said that it was so, but the student revealed his personal artifact, to which Enslave replied that he was simply reacting to their attack. Enslave argued that he was right and believed that even if they had started a fight, the teacher would have simply stood aside. His words made the professor angry. Enslave asked him what the teacher would do about the insults and slander that had been spat at him, to which he merely replied that he had not noticed it. This made Enslave truly furious, and he brought his sword to his opponent's face. The young man could no longer control his anger and was dissatisfied with the professor's decision. But fortunately, Doyan stopped him with a powerful flick. She merely flicked him, but with such force that Enslave immediately came to his senses. Doyan said that he needed to be more restrained and not take out his sword, wave it around, and think he is all-powerful, acting arrogant. Enslave's energy disappeared and the teacher was no longer standing aside. He really treated Enslave that way only because he was from the lower dimension. Meanwhile, Yuwan and Russell continued to stand aside so as not to get involved in any unnecessary troubles. Doyan continued to scold Enslave, saying that this is what he really is like when he has a divine weapon in his hand. After such an outburst of emotions, Yuwan suggested that the guys not get involved in such things again, because then they would not be treated well at the academy. Enslave didn't think that Yuwan was the one to talk about it, to which he replied that he wasn't the one who tried to fight the professor, and besides, he made an official statement about his sparring, unlike Enslave. Enslave thought he could improve the situation like Yuwan did last time, but he ended up almost causing a lot of trouble. Yuwan didn't understand why Enslave left the provocateur alone and immediately tried to fight with the teacher. If it was in a normal state, he wouldn't have acted so recklessly, but it seemed like he had suddenly changed, as if someone had flipped a switch. Plus, his sword. Yuwan asked Enslave to be honest with him and asked about the power he showed earlier, wondering if he could control it. Enslave replied that of course he could, otherwise he wouldn't have passed the entrance exam, but he was just angry at the time because of the professor's lie. Yuwan noted that this was true, because lying was bad, and Enslave, looking around, said that this was exactly the case. He asked again if he could be trusted to control his power. Enslave assured him that this was indeed the case and that he would not cause any more trouble. Doyan also added that she was glad that at least Enslave said that he would not cause any more trouble, but seeing how his artifact smeared him was quite entertaining. Enslave was grateful that his friends trusted him, but he was still a little offended. Doyan also said that she began to understand the professor's advice that they should be more relaxed around other students. After all, if they continued like this, student life would be even more noisy than it was now. So she wondered what Yuwan, as the class representative, thought about it. Over the past few days at the academy, Yuwan had definitely realized the reason for his uneasiness. A way of thinking of others based on inner strength and superiority, an incomprehensible disdain for the lower dimensions, which made everything easier for people from the upper dimensions, and the attitudes that have formed over the years that consider this to be the norm. Yuwan was faced with the question of what outsiders could do in a place where this was considered the norm. So he asked his classmates what they thought it took to establish rapport or gain acceptance from any large enough group. Enslave suggested that conversations, Doyan, oddly enough, power. Russell refrained from answering. Yuwan said it was close, but still not what we needed. He noted that what is important to them is how they look in the eyes of others. That's why they decided to create a channel about their daily life. They will create their own image, which they will show to others. At the same time, it will be fixed in the consciousness and will make them easily recognizable, which in turn can develop into honor and respect. But Enslave didn't quite understand. If the most important thing for them was the admiration and respect of others, then why would he need to spar with Doyan? Yuwan replied that this would not be a simple show, but a sparring match according to the rules, so he better take it seriously. The sparring between Doyan and Enslave began, and Enslave had concerns about what was happening. But Doyan said that Yuwan shouldn't worry about Enslave not taking the fight seriously. After all, people become much more serious after taking a couple of punches. So it's just a matter of time, and in the meantime, Enslave has had a hard time. Yuwan thought it must be painful, but at the same time it was a good shot for their channel. Doyan began to mock Enslave a little. Was this really all he was capable of? And it seemed that he really was nothing without his artifact. She didn't mind if he got it, but even so, she could defeat him. Her words awakened a real anger in Enslave, similar to the one he had during the lesson when he had drawn his sword. But Russell had concerns about Yuwan's idea. Would it really make their lives at the academy easier? Yuwan wasn't sure if it would work, but it would still have some effect. After all, if those guys had initially known what they were capable of, they would have thought 1,000 times before messing with them. At that time, the seriousness of sparring between classmates was gaining momentum. That's why Yuwan asked her not to jump to conclusions, because her beauty was too valuable for her to worry about. He also added that a pretty face with a smile looks even better. Wherever she is with her face, she can conquer anyone, so it would be an unforgivable waste if she frowned, so it is better to save the worries for later. Russell was pleased to hear this from Yuwan, and in the meantime, Enslave leaves the battlefield because he does not intend to fight this monster. The next person on camera was Russell, specifically a video of her eating noodle soup, albeit with a lot of cilantro. Yuwan assured her that it would be okay. She would get used to the taste. Following what Yuwan had suggested, the 11th graders began uploading videos of their daily lives to the channel they created, Rebellion. Their videos literally blew up the intranet and made them recognizable. People loved everything they filmed, including Doyan and Enslave's sparring. Videos of them all playing a board game together also became popular. Even the video of the tea party in Yuman's office got a lot of views. And as expected, Russell's video became one of the most popular due to her cuteness. Everyone liked their videos for their simplicity, and even more intrigued by the upcoming broadcast, in which they were going to conquer the tower. The guys were simply delighted with how quickly they managed to gain recognition on YouTube. Their channel already had more than 1,000 subscribers in just one day. But Enslave was still worried about why the video of him being beaten by Doyan became the most popular on the channel. Professor Yumina was also happy for her students, because unification is a higher dimension, full of real miracles. In a world where miracles are taken for granted, no one even thought of creating content on it. But this channel and the content they make has cleverly straddled the line between ordinary miracles. The connection between them and the atmosphere was just amazing. However, today was the first day they would enter the tower. The professor was worried about the students, so she asked them to be attentive and asked if everyone was really prepared. Yuwan was the only one among them who was wearing a student uniform. It was quite awkward for him. The thing is, Yuwan lived in a peaceful place, so he didn't have any special clothes for fighting. Yet this was the life he had chosen and the place where he would fight, putting his life on the line, so clothes didn't matter to him. And since everyone is happy with everything and everyone is ready, it's time to go to the tower. Once they moved into the tower, they were immediately noticed by other participants. They immediately recognized them as those same guys from the Vostani channel. The tower is open from dawn, but entry is based on skill level. They are on the second-year line, thanks to their fame. There were also those in the tower who were not particularly happy to see them, such as the very same trio that had bothered Russell and then Enslave. But this danger seemed of little importance compared to another, more important problem. After all, Erecto was also here, looking at them with an obvious desire to kill. So today is the day they conquered the tower, and soon after that, they spar with Erecto. There are only 4 days left, during which time Yuwan must become stronger. During this time, he intends to reach such a level that Erecto will not even be able to touch him. The professor also noted that for safety reasons, she would like the children to finish early and return before the weekend. But this is not for her to decide, but for them to decide. So she was interested to know how long they thought it would take to climb the tower. After consulting, the guys came to a unanimous decision. They would need 2 nights and 3 days. During this time, they will be able to conquer the tower and return on time. For Yuwan, conquering the tower meant more than just academic success at the academy or the outcome of the sparring match with Erecto. First of all, he wanted to show his ancestors that their work would live on. Before the hike, the students asked the professor if it was possible to film inside the tower. This will be done by an artifact with a personality created in the likeness of Eve and Lilith. But the professor noted that the footage would be of little use because the tower is a constantly changing structure. Enslave also read about this in the manual. It said that the internal structure of the tower is constantly changing, and the equipment he wants to take with him breaks down very quickly. The professor added that each floor is called a room, and when they defeat the monsters in it or deal with all the traps, the space itself transfers the group to the next room. This is called a shift, and the more of them there are, the deeper they go into the tower. Therefore, once the purification was completed, they would never be able to return to the same room. Besides, a new room meant different monsters, stronger than the previous ones, and similar traps. Doyan also had one question for the professor, but it wasn't quite the same as Yuwan's. She asked what would happen if one of the students died while climbing the tower. Yuwan and Enslave were very surprised because they had already forgotten that you can die right in the battle in the tower. Yumina noted that this was a very important question, and it was good that they asked it. But contrary to their fears, in most areas of the tower, the subjects do not actually die, even if they do. To be more precise, if someone dies, they are simply thrown back towards the entrance of the tower. However, thanks to the student card that records their progress, they won't have to start from the beginning. When they re-enter, they'll pick up where they left off. Enslave suggested that since they could be resurrected, they could keep trying as long as they wanted. However, Doyan had additional questions regarding this. Yumina said that, in most areas, test subjects don't die, meaning there are places where they can die. In this case, the tower does not guarantee their complete safety. The professor noticed Doyan's attentiveness and replied that it was so. In some cases, they may actually face actual death, but this did not stop the students from setting out to climb the tower. The first monster they encountered was the Cloudsider, a notorious monster that devoured all of an explorer's gear. But thanks to the students' skills and strength, it was not difficult to defeat him. While the others were fighting, Yuwan was lost in his thoughts. He discovered the concept of fire, but he could not extract it. In the dungeons, there was no such problem, so the young man wondered why he could not do it in the tower. Understanding the reason may be the key to unlocking the boy's abilities. Meanwhile, Doyan came to him to ask if he had found out anything. Yuwan tried to put out the flames, but it didn't work. Doyan responded that it was a shame, because if it had worked out, they could have used the features of each location in the tower. Suddenly, a huge Cloudsider appeared behind the girl, who literally wanted to eat her. But Yuwan managed to react in time and fought off the threat. Or to be more precise, it was Eve, who, although she had taken the basic form of a snake, could still continue to transform into a weapon. So it wasn't too hard to get through this level of the tower. Yuwan noted that he had stronger weapons, but they were a bit noisy. But Doyan replied that she doubted that his weapon would be noisier than Russell and Enslave's. She thought it was ridiculous, because the basis of dungeon battles was to move stealthily, avoiding detection of opponents, and not to smash everything in sight. Russell and Enslave's fighting style was very different from their normal life. However, they managed to clear the first room with Cloudsiders. But still, you shouldn't relax ahead of time, because there is a strong accumulation of energy nearby. And it looks like a bigger and stronger monster is about to appear, that same elite. Enslave wanted to offer Yuwan the use of his eyes to find the target, but at that moment Yuwan was just about to use them. He managed to find something similar to an obelisk that was absorbing a lot of energy, and it looked like someone was supposed to emerge from it. Since it was Russell who possessed the furious explosive force, she rushed towards the obelisk. Her fighting style was reminiscent of a berserker, as she seemed to lose her composure during an attack and destroy everything in her path. With a powerful blow, she easily breaks the obelisk, not giving the elite monster a chance to appear. In place of the obelisk, an improved core was formed, which is a very rare item. After picking it up, Russell began to change, something that Yuwan was the first to notice. Or rather, her hair gradually began to change color to a darker one. At first, Yuwan didn't understand what had happened, since the core shouldn't have had such an effect. Russell understood the reason and was worried that she would be misunderstood and turned away from. This was the result of Russell's power, a kind of forge of the heart, a concept that uses emotions as fuel, burning them to gain power. In other words, berserk. Rochelle was afraid that perhaps she looked too scary when she was angry. Yuwan replied that it was not like that and everything was fine. On the contrary, she seemed reliable, but Russell was still worried that if things got worse, she might lose control. Doyan noted that everything was indeed fine and she didn't need to worry. Besides, if she lost control of herself, Doyan would kill her before she could cause any harm. These words caused a confused reaction from the other boys. Yuwan tried to convince Doyan that this was not right, as they would have to start the exploration all over again. But Doyan only replied that they would have to continue conquering the tower together if Russell continued in the same spirit. Not even that, she would have preferred to be in a group with only him because the others didn't inspire hope. These words hurt Russell and disrupted the mutual understanding between the guys. But Yuwan promised to think of something and understood why Russell was so timid. He promised that he would find a solution because it was the job of the headman to find a way out. His words made Russell happy, and now she was less worried about what was happening. In her eyes, Yuwan looked like a prince, but from the outside, for Eslight and Doyan, it looked strange. Despite all the conflicts, the students managed to pass one shift and go to the second room. The second room was not much different from the first, except for the moss and weeds. The elite monster core that fell from the obelisk had many different concepts, such as acid and fusion. Yuwan got as many concepts from just one room as if he had gone through the goblin cave 10 times. Acid and fusion are attributes that can dissolve substances. They must have appeared when they defeated the Klausider. He fused his sword with it and passed the remaining acid to Eve. Doyan crept up to him unnoticed. She was also interested in seeing how Yuwan applied the concepts. She also noted that if he trained his senses better, he would be harder to scare. At this point, something odd began to happen in the room. Eslight reminded his friends to be more serious because monsters would appear soon. One should be more careful, but Doyan had a different opinion. For her, the second room seemed no different from the first. No matter how careless the lion was, how could an ant's bite kill him? Meanwhile, evil spirits appeared in the room, harmful entities that target the magic inside living beings. Eslight said that enemies are usually caught off guard when they least expect it. Doyan suggested a small idea. How about having Yuwan walk through the room alone? Yuwan was surprised because he didn't understand where such harsh suggestions came from. Russell and Eslight were of the same opinion. It was too dangerous, but Doyan noted that it was the opposite. She explained that he needed to develop his abilities, especially because of the sparring he had coming up the following week. There was truth in Doyan's words, and Yuwan didn't deny it. So he agreed to such an adventure and decided to try to get through the room on his own. Eslight tried to stop him, but Yuwan insisted on his own. After all, as Doyan said, he needs to quickly raise his stats, so it would be a waste if they spent all their strength here. He needs to close the gap between them as quickly as possible. Russell and Eslight decided to trust him, but if anything happens, they will immediately rush to help. Yuwan also asked Doyan if she would help him if he got tired. She replied that at least she promised that he would not die from overexertion. This is what he wanted to hear from her, and now it was time to show what he was capable of. And in this he will be helped by his living artifact, which is actually his main weapon. He transformed it into a real automatic weapon, which he used back when going through dungeons. With such a weapon, it was not difficult for Yuwan to pass through the evil spirits. There was no trace left of the monsters. The bullets seemed to burn through them. Russell and Eslight were surprised because they had never seen Yuwan's strength before. Was this a normal weapon from Yuwan's world? The speed at which he defeated monsters was simply astonishing. Eslight thought that if the soldiers of their countries had such weapons, how everything would change. His weapon looked like a rapid-fire launcher, but it fired metal pellets. With such a weapon, he could deal with third and possibly second-class assassins. Such an item is useful even in the world of martial arts. However, this style of attack is too straightforward. He is good at ranged combat, but at close range. The main disadvantage of such an attack was that in such a tight space, he could easily be surrounded. Enemies can easily strike from a blind spot, which is what happened to Yuwan. Eslight and Russell were about to rush to his aid, but it was not necessary. But Yuwan didn't only have such weapons. It was not for nothing that he trained in martial arts with Doyan. So he easily dealt with the threat that crept up from behind. The boys were glad that he was not hurt, and at the same time surprised when he used the sword. They had no idea he was so skilled with close-range weapons. It was indeed not bad, but Yuwan noted that it was not good enough. After all, he's still not as good as Eslight or Doyan. Doyan watched with a smile as Yuwan became proficient in martial arts after her training. Yuwan combined attacks. While Eva killed the enemies in front, he dealt with those who came from behind. The adrenaline in his veins was pumping and he felt himself getting stronger. As a result, Yuwan managed to clear the room by himself. It was exhausting, but not too hard. There was one last evil spirit left. After it was destroyed, the next shift would occur, so Yuwan suggested taking a short break. Meanwhile, his abilities continued to surprise Doyan. The part of the monster he cut off was melting and disintegrating, and he was using the skills he had just learned in the previous room. How could he learn so quickly? Enslave was amazed by Yuwan's resourcefulness. After all, not everyone would have thought of controlling the shift in such a way without killing the last monster. Doyan also praised him, saying that it was a good job and the final hit was just superb. She also added that if only he wasn't so focused on quick sword strikes, it would be better, but it's still better than being just a fool who only has a sword, hinting at Enslave. While Enslave was proving to Doyan that he was right and that he too had fought bravely, Yuwan decided to get a drink, but only he could enjoy this beautiful and peaceful moment. After all, Yuwan had completely forgotten that only he could afford such luxury. Yuwan was surprised when everyone looked at him with hateful eyes. He said that he bought the drink in the city. That was the problem. Only he could go beyond the academy. Yuwan justified himself by saying that even if he wanted to share, he couldn't because he hadn't bought much. But that was a lie. Besides, the drink just relieves fatigue a little. But it's not the time to think about such things, because they are still in the tower. Doyan wants to go through the next room herself. Yuwan didn't quite understand why she wanted to clear the next room alone, since Doyan had previously said that he should fight to become stronger. In fact, she also wanted to try soda, since she had never drunk it before. But anyway, enough sitting around, it's time to move on. After the last monster was destroyed, the shift began as expected. Meanwhile, Yuwan had a lot of thoughts about upgrading his stats. He is already at the average level in the academy. During the time he has been here, he has only swung a sword a few times. But despite this, fencing and piercing, which he had only just begun to master, had already improved, simply incredible pumping speed. With such efficiency, it is worth concentrating on fencing, because sparring is already on Tuesday. It all depends on how much he can improve his martial arts skills. After all, the difference between Yuwan and Erecto is more than 200 points. It's simply unthinkable. Frankly speaking, there was no way Yuwan would be able to close that gap in ability over the weekend, no matter how hard he tried. But while studying with Doyan, he caught a small hint. Acquiring skills is important, but improving them is even more important when it comes to developing martial arts. But learning these skills alone would be very difficult. So it would be a huge plus for Yuwan if Doyan taught him a couple more techniques. Yuwan thought it was wrong because it would make him dependent on her, and he didn't like that. There's no need to rush. There's still time to think. While Yuwan was lost in his thoughts, he didn't notice how he and his friends started to fall down. Enslave managed to grab the wall and shouted for Yuwan to hold on to him, but it was too late, and he was quickly falling down. Yuwan didn't understand what happened and why the floor underneath them suddenly disappeared. But there was no time to think, because he and Russell were falling straight to the ground. And the worst thing was right on the floor, a trap with sharp spikes. Yuwan used the artifact, managed to catch Russell, who was flying down, and grabbed onto the wall. If he had hesitated even for a second, Russell would have ended up right on those spikes. Fortunately, at the last moment, Yuwan and Russell still managed to escape. The young man did not understand what had happened, why the room was so huge, and even with a trap on the floor. Yuwan thought that this might be the boss's room, but then he heard Doyan's voice. She stood confidently with her feet right on the ceiling and advised him not to stay in one place for too long. This is a room with a lot of traps, so he can easily die here. Suddenly, a hatch opened behind Yuwan and arrows flew out at a furious speed. But they weren't the only ones there. The traps seemed to be a weapons depot, and the worst thing was that they were very sharp. The situation had escalated, and Yuwan needed to make a decision and find a way out as quickly as possible. It was difficult to dodge because with one hand he held Russell, who was on the verge of death. But since things have gone this way, the time has come to use your entire arsenal. Using Eva, he managed to dodge the flying weapon. He then grabbed Russell and summoned his new living artifact, Lilith. It was not for nothing that he bought such a wonderful hoverbike in Ronica. He told Russell to hold on tight because this place was full of traps, and it looked like they were all aimed at them. It seemed like the room was one big trap because there was a trap set at every corner. It looks like now is the time for Yuwan to level up his escape power. But the flying weapon attacked not only Yuwan and Russell, but others as well. The traps also reacted to Enslave. He used his artifact, which grants him wings, allowing him to fly freely. With the help of the wings granted by the artifact, he was able to repel the flying threat. Despite this, there was something that was bothering Enslave. The professor said that the traps won't appear until room 20. But they're only in the third, so why has the difficulty changed so much? Enslave was also curious about what artifact Yuwan had summoned again. He was, as always, surprised by Yuwan's resourcefulness, and even a little envious. Meanwhile, Yuwan was trying his best to dodge the attacks. There were traps everywhere they went. Russell was thinking about the moment when Yuwan caught her. She thought that this was a definite sign from him and decided to act as well. Yuwan had a completely different opinion and was surprised by such a sudden change in the situation. But now he needed to focus on the more important thing, surviving. The attacks continued unabated and their supplies seemed endless. Enslave joined them, not understanding why Yuwan was so bad at dodging when everything had been fine before. But Yuwan also had a question. Where did Enslave get those wings from? Enslave was also curious about what kind of thing Yuwan was riding on. Yuwan replied that it was the hover bike he purchased and then asked if the three of them were here. Then where was Doyan? Enslave replied that he didn't see her. Maybe she fell into a trap. But Yuwan said that it couldn't be that she fell into a trap so easily. Meanwhile, Doyan, dodging the traps, easily avoided them thanks to her agility. Yuwan was sure that she was okay and that she was currently secretly watching them. Enslave wondered when this would all end. Yuwan said that according to the manual, they had to hold out here for a while, but how long was unknown. He suggested that Enslave run to the other side while he analyzed the traps. All the traps suddenly aimed at the flying Enslave. Yuwan tried to guess what the priority of the traps was. It seemed that priority was given to moving objects. It turned out that it was enough to just stand still and not move, and the traps would not be activated. Meanwhile, Russell noticed that one of the arrows had actually wounded Lilith. Yuwan pulled out an arrow and wanted to tell the boys that they just needed to stop moving unnecessarily. But in that case, how will they be able to get through the room in that case? Yuwan also noticed something strange. The arrow he picked up suddenly burst into flames. Did he absorb it and learn the concept? That's weird because he couldn't learn anything in the first room. What changed? The young man began to think that the reason must be related to his characteristics. Or was it just a coincidence? Yuwan wanted to know more about it, and the only way to know if it's true or a coincidence is to check again. He picked up the sword and somehow managed to absorb it. Without realizing it, he had learned a new concept, although, theoretically, he should have received the concept of sword. He acquired the concept of decapitation and did not understand why exactly that one. Come to think of it, this concept was different from what he had seen before. But at this time, Enslave began to have very big problems. He lost his vigilance, thinking that he only needed to be wary of traps, and who would have thought that water would also flow from them. But it wasn't just water. Most likely there was something mixed into it, because after this, Enslave's senses began to dull, and everything around him became blurry. Besides this, he was surrounded by dozens of other traps. If things continue like this, he won't have time to react to the next one. But Yuwan rushed to his aid, realizing the situation Enslave found himself in. So he left Russell, and at that moment he himself rushed to Enslave. Yuwan explained to her that he was going to do something that was very similar to a lottery, and therefore didn't want to involve her in it. She was worried about her friend, because knowing him, he would do anything to save the people close to him. Meanwhile, Yuwan began to come up with a plan. Learning another concept increased the acid and wave values by 10. As Yuwan had expected, as before he touched the water, but he acquired not water, but a wave. It now became clear to him why the previously absorbed concept was beheading and not sword. At the same time, Doyan also rushed to their aid, hearing the sounds of water. As she got closer, she was surprised to see Yuwan's actions and didn't understand what he was planning. Meanwhile, he continued to rush faster and faster. Along the way, he realized something. The state of matter in a particular form at a given moment determines what concept can be acquired. Those projectiles were aimed at his neck, so they carried the concept of decapitation and not sword. So now he understood how he could repel all attacks and save Enslave. The deeper Yuwan's all-seeing gaze became, the further beyond the essence it could penetrate. Enslave was in incredible surprise when he saw Yuwan flying above him. It seemed like he was flying straight towards the traps that were flying at him. Yuwan was certain that in order to repel the shells, he needed to understand their intentions. After all, his strength lies in concepts, and the more he understands them, the stronger he becomes. Therefore, Yuwan's strength depends entirely on himself. He rose high up to become a priority for the shells, thus he wanted to read them. Enslave was at a loss, as it looked like Yuwan, having lost hope, was simply heading straight into a trap. Yuwan was still thinking about what he should do. He realized that he didn't need to absorb all the concepts. It will be enough to simply continue to combine them as long as he succeeds, and then separate them into parts. This is enough to break all the shells and move on to the next room. And Yuwan's plan was successful. He managed to save Enslave and eliminate all the flying projectiles. Looking at it from the outside, Russell realized that she had made the right choice by trusting Yuwan. Enslave was the one who was most worried about him, so the first thing he did was ask if his friend was okay. Yuwan said that everything was fine, and he was glad that Enslave was okay. Enslave was curious about what it was. He replied that he didn't know yet, but it looked like everything that was flying at them had come together into one whole. It felt like he had received something amazing. Enslave thought that perhaps Yuwan had awakened a new ability that allowed him to directly interact with traps. Suddenly, several more traps reacted to them, from which projectiles flew straight at the boys. The guys were so taken aback that they didn't even have time to react properly. But at that moment, Russell and Doyan appeared and easily repelled the shells. For Yuwan, it looked impressive, but Enslave was more surprised by Doyan's appearance because he thought that she was already stuck in one of the traps. They managed to get through the third room and move to the next one. A small conflict began between Doyan and Enslave again. She called it ridiculous because he had let his guard down again and got into trouble. Enslave thought it was a very rude way to address someone who had almost died. Yuwan just watched from the sidelines as he saw how well the two of them were getting along. However, when things get dangerous, they rush in to help everyone. Isn't that proof of complex teamwork? But Doyan replied that she was simply waiting for the moment because one day, having acquired a debtor, she would ask for the debt when she needed it. Yuwan hoped that this sense of camaraderie was not just an illusion, and in the meantime, they moved to the fourth room. At first glance, she didn't seem to pose any threat, and there were no traps nearby. But the peculiarity of this room was something else. It was filled with monsters. Yuwan was confident that dealing with them would be a piece of cake for him. He used his usual artifact, transforming it into a firearm. But he couldn't even scratch the enemy. In this room were the tower spiders, unique monsters that can appear on any floor of the tower, regardless of the level. Enslave also added that they have random characteristics. They do not depend on the floor. It looks like this time, Yuwan won't be able to handle everything alone. They'll have to work together. Yuwan wasn't happy with this situation. It was hard for him to believe that such strong monsters had already appeared in the fourth room. But Doyan asked them not to interfere. She wants to show Yuwan something, so he should watch more carefully. She used her gust of wind technique, concentrating a strong flow of energy. And she released energy like a beam, which was exactly what Yuwan was looking for. Doyan easily destroys enemies standing in the path of the energy beam. Yuwan was surprised once again to see how strong Doyan was. The spiders had no chance to dodge or resist such an attack, so most of them were knocked out. Doyan suggested leaving it to Yuwan to deal with them. She called herself the most merciful ruler they had ever seen. Although Yuwan had heard similar words from her before, he still felt uneasy every time. But this is not so important. The more important goal now will be to destroy all enemies. Yuwan used his sword and headed towards the spiders. After what Doyan showed him, he had more confidence in himself. It seemed that now he would be able to defeat such a strong enemy, and the guys were extremely surprised when they saw this. The spiders' bodies were so hard that the young man could not even cut them with his sword. The monster also did not sleep and went on a counterattack. Jumping into the air, he rushed at Yuwan. But this is just the perfect chance for Yuwan to back off a bit, and then destroy the spider with the piercing blow that Doyan taught him. The other guys were also glad that Yuwan was able to cut down the monster, but still, it was pretty pointless if you couldn't cut them down right away. Yuwan can't keep hitting and retreating when there are so many of them around. He'll just end up falling into their trap. However, he is not just a boy with a sword. His main specialty is concepts, and from the previous room, he got 20 destruction. Now is the time to test their compatibility with the sword. And it worked. His artifact sword evolved due to its excellent compatibility with the wielder. Now it is the executioner's longsword, with destructive characteristics. From now on, it won't be difficult for Yuwan to cut down a couple of spiders at once. The time had come for the young man to try out his new sword and show his strength, and he succeeded. He easily cut through several spiders at once, which he had not even been able to scratch before. The guys were simply delighted with the young man and how quickly he became stronger, but this aroused even greater interest in Doyan. Yuwan was also surprised by his punch. He managed to land a clean punch, but it felt completely different, as if he had swung too hard. Looks like he still has a lot of practice to do with his new sword. There were too many spiders, so Enslave and Russell rushed to help Yuwan. Doyan continued to think to the side about how Yuwan had become so strong in that moment. She was surprised at how he managed to cut through enemies he couldn't even touch. It was the first time she had seen someone capable of such intuitive and compelling abilities. He hones his skills without relying on strength alone, and that was truly amazing. After all, usually when someone strengthens their weapon or finds a better one, they end up waving it around like a fool, but he completely lacked that flaw. Even if not now, one day he will understand the true essence of the thrust on his own. So Doyan didn't see any point in interfering. However, wouldn't it be a waste if she left it like that? After overcoming the 3 tribulations, Doyan was proud to be called the greatest genius in the martial arts world. And now she just stands there and looks at the man whose talent makes her past look pathetic. This state of affairs did not make Doyan very happy, and it gave her some thoughts. That's why she wanted to make Yuwan hers to fight by her side. Although Doyan didn't say it out loud, Yuwan seemed to have heard it all. This sent shivers down his spine. Yuwan thought that the boss was about to show up. Yuwan asked Doyan why she was standing there and not doing anything. Didn't she want the soda he bought in town? Doyan really wanted it, but she thought that Yuwan really only had 1 can of soda, but that was a lie. Meanwhile, all the students received a message, something that happened very rarely. Not only they received it, but also all the remaining students of the academy who were in the tower. But the content of the message was frightening. It said that all participants needed to leave the tower immediately, from the rector himself. Meanwhile, Russell noticed a strange aura of movement, but Doyan kept saying that she didn't want to fight because Yuwan didn't give her the drink. But Russell told them that the enemies were approaching, so they needed to prepare. Meanwhile, portals appeared and countless spiders crawled out of them. S-Light assumed that this was exactly what the professor had told them at that meeting. The student crystal also doesn't work, and the guys really are in a death trap. It looks like they are in a situation where even students could die. The monsters began to rush in a crowd straight towards the young students. There were so many of them that it seemed they could simply cover them. It was simply incredibly complex, and the most frightening thing about it all was that this was only the beginning. The professor said something about the possibility of a space pirate invasion when newbies were climbing the tower. The problem is that their anomalous invasion leads to the emergence of an unpredictable phenomenon, irregularity. And as a rule, in a normal playthrough, students do not die. But as soon as things become unusual, everything changes. The rules inside the tower are turned upside down. Safe zones become dangerous. The number of monsters also grows uncontrollably, as if someone is endlessly generating them. In addition to all this, the level of difficulty of the rooms also jumps unpredictably. And at the same time, many other problems begin to arise, such as traps. Therefore, the tower cannot guarantee your safety. You need to keep such things in mind. So if they realize that they are in the phenomenon of irregularity, they need to know that this is a really dangerous situation. Therefore, the best solution in this situation is to run as fast as possible in the hope of finding a way out, or find a more spacious room so that the monsters don't squeeze them in. There were just an awful lot of spiders, so the guys decided to move to a more spacious place. Russell was already beside herself with rage, in particular because of the peculiarity of her abilities. It seemed that there were not just a lot of spiders, but an infinite number of them. Doyan tried to deal with them using wind currents. S-Light continued to attack along with her, but there were too many monsters. At least Doyan and S-Light could resist them. Russell also did not stand still and cut up monsters with incredible speed, which made her hair even darker. She doesn't even say anything anymore, and if her hair changes completely, she'll most likely lose her composure. This would be a nightmare scenario, so Yuwan didn't want to let that happen. Doyan also noticed that Russell had changed a lot and had gone completely crazy. She also couldn't continue at this pace. If she didn't switch soon, the situation would become even more dangerous. Yuwan took the drink that relieves fatigue a little from his inventory and gave it to Doyan. For now, he'll hold off the spiders, and in the meantime, she'll be able to rest and finish her soda. The girl was glad that she could finally try this miracle drink. Still, she wondered if Yuwan could really handle such a crowd. But Yuwan already had a small plan, so he was full of confidence. And since there really are a lot of spiders, it will be very difficult to kill them with a sword. You need a more massive weapon, like, for example, a grenade. The explosion was simply gigantic, as if it was not one small grenade, but a whole bomb. Some of the spiders exploded, and the rest continued to burn. S-Light was delighted with Yuwan. He once again showed something new and amazing with his power. Yuwan told him to rest and he would kill some of the spiders with his sword. S-Light and Doyan were already a little tired, but Russell had quite enough strength. However, she couldn't be relied on because she was too unpredictable. So letting S-Light and Doyan rest was the best solution. Suddenly, Yuwan received a notification window that his sword's blood poison had been increased to 15. He didn't understand why this happened, but the window said that it was because he had poorly grasped the concept of a slashing blow and acquired it. The depth of understanding reached 2 units. The sword changed its usual color to red and became even stronger. Yuwan didn't fully understand how the blood poison effect worked, and when else, if not now, will he be able to find out for sure? Yuwan continued to cut the spiders with incredible speed and strength, not giving them even the slightest chance to approach him. Still, the hoverbike is good for more than just getting around the city, but Yuwan noticed something odd. The trajectory of his sword also widened, so while the slashing blow increases the power of dismemberment, the blood poison increases the range and distance for the attack. But one of the downsides is that the sword uses the owner's blood to do this. Therefore, Yuwan won't be able to use it too often. It felt like he was getting a blood test with every swing. S-Light was curious about what Yuwan was up to again, and what was the strange aura around his sword. Meanwhile, Russell continued to commit genocide among the spiders. Yuwan pointed out that the others shouldn't interfere until they had had enough rest. But S-Light replied that he had had enough rest, and that Yuwan should take a look around. The seemingly endless swarm of spiders noticeably diminished. Of course, the guys killed a fair number, but it still looked more like the flow of monsters suddenly stopped. Maybe the battle is over, or vice versa, because now something like a boss will appear. Meanwhile, Russell completely lost control over herself and her actions. Suddenly, another portal appeared, and out came the boss of the room, who was significantly different from the previous spiders. Yuwan didn't understand why an elite boss appeared on their floor, since they usually start from room 50. But then S-Light notices something even more terrifying and tells Yuwan to look at it. Turning around, Yuwan was beside himself with surprise. Usually there is only one elite boss, but they have two. The situation couldn't be worse. It looks like the trap room was just a walk in the park. Elite boss both in front and behind, plus student crystals don't work, so if they die, it's for good. While the others were fussing and thinking about what to do, Rushel had already rushed into battle. She didn't care what kind of opponent she faced. Her main goal was to defeat him. Yuwan suggested that they split up. He and Doyan would take one boss, and Enslave would stay closer to Rushel. This way they will have a better chance of defeating the monsters. Enslave rushed to help Rushel, although she did not really need his support. Meanwhile, Yuwan began to think about how to defeat the boss. He used slashing and blood poison to cut down the spiders, but could he do it with such a huge thing? Meanwhile, Doyan continued to calmly finish her soda. Yuwan knew that he couldn't handle it on his own, but he refused to ask Doyan for help, so she didn't understand whether it was pride or stubbornness. However, she liked the soda, and the taste was quite unusual, so from now on, he will pay his debt to Doyan with soda. Meanwhile, Doyan had already drawn her sword for the first time in a long time. Yuwan didn't understand why she needed a sword when she could handle it with her bare hands. He thought she wanted to show him some special move, but Doyan replied that she just didn't want to get her hands dirty. But still, she wanted to hint to Yuwan what he was missing to complete his attack. She'll only show it once, but that blow should be enough for him to figure it out. So Doyan told Yuwan to look more closely and focus on what he saw. But it was at this moment that Yuwan turned his gaze away after hearing Enslave's screams. At that moment he was attacked by Rushel, who mistook him for a monster. Meanwhile, the spider released something that looked like a web, but more like mucus, into them. Rushel managed to dodge, but Enslave was completely immersed in the substance. The monster also didn't seem to expect that she would be able to dodge his attack. This made Rushel even more furious. All her hair turned dark, she completely lost control. Now it felt like a fight between two monsters, rather than a student versus an elite boss. Doyan tells him again to not lose focus and look at her. After all, she will only show this blow once, so he should remember it. With a powerful slash, Doyan breaks the seemingly invincible monster into two pieces. It's just a swing of the sword, a simple movement, a cut from the bottom up. In this extremely simple movement, Yuwan saw death dividing the world. After that, Yuwan received a notification window that he instantly began to understand advanced techniques, and along with that, his control power increased. And also the depth of understanding of what was seen, heard, and said increased by 5 units. In addition, the young man managed to grasp part of a very powerful and complex concept of martial arts. Many concepts increased several times. Just by noticing a bit of her martial arts skills, Yuwan's internal code rose incredibly quickly. A power similar to the one Doyan used to break Ortima's force field. Perhaps an improved version of that move that breaks through the power of death was released at that moment. Yuwan thought, how could a human put such a will into his sword? The concept of death he had learned earlier became so vivid and clear that it gave him goosebumps. Yuwan lost his attention for a moment and seemed to fall out of the world, but Doyan quickly brought him back to his senses. She also gave him the core that fell from the spider. The core had many concepts, but still, would it be right if he took it, since it was Doyan who defeated the boss? But she replied that everything was fine. It was his reward, so he could safely take it for himself. Meanwhile, Enslave continued to be in the slime and could not get out, so he asked the guys to help him. Besides, right now Rushel is going completely crazy. In such a situation, Enslave looked simply useless. And if Yuwan interferes in the fight with Rushel, it seems like he will be gone in a second. So in this situation, the only one who can stop the maddened Rushel is Doyan. After all, among the three, she is the strongest and does not feel sorry for Rushel. But she didn't really want to stop her because she had already done her part of the job. For some reason, Yuwan thought that Doyan wouldn't like it if one of them died in such an unusual situation, and who knows what would happen next. Meanwhile, the spider seemed to still have the strength to fight and was slowly rising. Doyan still agreed to try to stop Rushel, but in exchange, Yuwan had to finish off the boss himself. Doyan used the wind currents to provoke Rushel into attacking her. She wanted the distraught girl to come down to her, but Yuwan didn't understand why she wanted that. However, it seemed she had her own way of calming Rushel down. The furious Rushel jumped off the spider and rushed straight at Doyan. It seemed that she could have turned her into dust if she had not managed to dodge her jump. Yet it was not difficult for Doyan to dodge Rushel's chaotic attacks. The difference between them wasn't just in strength. Rushel attacked her randomly, so it was easy for Doyan to counterattack. And yet, even after such a throw over herself, Rushel did not give up. On the contrary, she became even more furious, her anger towards Doyan growing with each passing moment. Yuwan was surprised at how Doyan was able to handle her. From the outside, it really looked like she was just having fun. But the young man had no time to be distracted by this, because he also had something to do. His mission was to take down an elite boss, and it seemed like Yuwan wasn't confident that he could do it. But Doyan assured him that if he memorized the move she showed him properly, he should be able to defeat the monster easily. Yuwan was tormented by doubts about this. Meanwhile, the spider attacked him first, without waiting for Yuwan to do anything. Yuwan didn't understand what was going on, why he attacked at the very moment when everyone had retreated from him. After all, he was in a state close to death. Does the boss still think he can handle the enemy? But the young man also did not continue to stand aside and decided to attack the spider in response. He used Eve to shackle the spider and immobilize it, and it worked. The boys were surprised when Yuwan managed to tie the spider so easily. Meanwhile, he continued to attack him with his sword. Thanks to Eva, he immobilized the boss as much as possible. Next, Yuwan planned to use a slashing strike with blood poison to strike the moment the spider reached its reach. But his plan didn't work out as he wanted. Yuwan failed to cut through the spider. In order to kill the spider, Yuwan had to cut off its head. Only then could he kill it. Yuwan didn't understand why it didn't work. Was the slashing strike too short? However, there was one more thing. The blood poison was not activating properly. Considering this, it made sense to use the two abilities in succession, since Yuwan had hardly done something like this before. However, at this moment, Yuwan began to have trouble. The spider managed to break the chains that bound him. He attacked him at a moment when the young man did not even expect it. The boys began to worry about him. Will he really be able to defeat the monster? Yuwan managed to survive by blocking the enemy's attack. But it was so hard and unexpected that for a second he thought he wouldn't be able to block the blow. As soon as his paw touched the blade of the sword, Yuwan managed to change the angle and deflect the blow. If he had taken the attack head-on, the sword and arm would have definitely been shattered into pieces. And yet he didn't understand how he managed to feel it. It was only a moment, but it seemed to turn into an eternity. Perhaps it was because he had seen Doyan's sword technique before. In the process of repelling the attack, he managed to understand and master the concept of flow. The depth of understanding of the flow reached 5 units. Yuwan never thought that what he saw could awaken the dark essence of martial arts within him that had been dormant somewhere deep inside that he didn't even know about. Even if he can't replicate Doyan's sword technique exactly, he has a backup plan. The battle between the spider and Yuwan continued, but for now the monster was the favorite. Meanwhile, Enslave began to wonder what Yuwan wanted to do. There is such a thing as a parry, a move that blocks or throws an opponent's attack to the side. It can prevent an attack or a fatal injury, and if successful, it can even counterattack the enemy. However, this is just a tactical concept, not a reality. In fact, it is quite easy to die before you master this skill. What was to be, and yet it still haunted Enslave. How can Yuwan try to master the technique in such a critical situation? Is it possible to master the technique of parrying in such conditions? Yuwan tried to block the attack by redirecting it in the other direction, and he succeeded in doing so. Little by little, he begins to see and predict the enemy's attacks. Meanwhile, Rushel did not calm down and continued to attack Doyan. Her attempts to hit her were so ridiculous that Doyan only had to put her foot out to make her fall to the ground. Still, Doyan knew that Yuwan would be able to draw some conclusions from that first blow, but she never imagined that he would show something so unexpected. A combat technique that embodies the essence of flow exists in the Central Plains. Few have attempted to master it, redirecting an enemy's attack in 100,000th of a second. This technique requires incredible reaction speed, and it looks like Yuwan is starting to get the hang of it. Mastering it involves too much risk and effort. Most people prefer simpler methods, such as Enslave. For someone like Doyan, who has always specialized in martial arts aimed at destruction, Yuwan makes her look at things in a new way. She had no idea that an insignificant and meaningless thing, considered an ordinary trick, would turn out to be unusually profound. But simply redirecting attacks won't end the battle. To win, you have to go beyond the boundaries. Since he's come this far, I wonder what Yuwan will show if he's able to master the flow to reflect his opponent's power. Will Yuwan be able to use this to counterattack? And now it was time for Yuwan to show what he had been able to understand in this short time. Using the power of piercing and dodging the attacks, using the additional second ability, Yuwan managed to land a blow. This time, Yuwan was able to pierce the elite boss and cut off his head. Doyan was so happy, it was as if she had killed a boss for the first time. Yuwan managed to master a new technique in such a short time and in such a critical situation, and as a result, defeated the elite boss. He succeeded in doing this. In addition, he was able to discover another more powerful concept, thanks to the temporary connection of concepts inside the body with an external concept. There are major changes happening inside Yuwan right now. Since Yuwan dealt with the boss, it would be nice to help Enslave get out and also calm Rushel down. But the young man felt that they were relying too much on someone who could hardly handle the boss. And yet he had an idea how to return Rushel to normal life. He absorbed the concept of the web that Enslave was caught in, and then he fed it to Eve, giving her an even newer and more powerful power. After this, he managed to create a magical chain network, another artifact. This net can already be used to catch Russell because she also sucks out magic. In this way, at least it will remain motionless, and over time it should return to its usual state. And fortunately, everything worked. Russell returned to her normal state as if nothing had happened. Even the student crystal started glowing again, meaning it was time to leave the tower. But suddenly another portal opened nearby. An unknown voice came from it, saying that they had managed to overcome the test. They didn't understand who it was or what kind of voice it was, but it kept saying something about a reward. Suddenly, someone began to appear from the portal, continuing to talk about something. She extended her hand to them and said that she was giving them a chance to make a pact with the thousand-eyed observer. Meanwhile, the professor was eagerly awaiting the students' return. Most of them had already returned, but her class was still missing, and that worried her. But suddenly a portal appeared right in front of her, from which the guys came out. All four managed to escape from the tower safely. The professor was glad to see them together and safe, and the first thing she asked was if the children were all right. She was really worried because there was a notice to leave the tower area, but no one ever showed up. She also asked whether the guys managed to clean up and what happened inside, but no one wanted to talk about what happened in detail. They moved a little away from the area, where there were many other students to continue the conversation without prying ears. Yuwan told the professor that after the fourth descent, they were caught off guard by an unusual room, and it had not been long since they entered. So he asked what happened on the other side when they entered the tower. The professor didn't really want to talk about it, but she still had to. The thing is that one of the students was killed by strangers inside the tower. The academy is currently trying to resolve the situation, but the students who were in the group with the victim are having a very hard time dealing with it. She reminded them of those same space pirates who target new students, and if they kill a student and take his student ID, he will never be able to be reborn and will be stuck in the tower forever. Yuwan asked Yumina what happened to the culprit and whether they had managed to catch him, but she replied that they had lost track of him, and the students who were there at the time had no way of stopping him. Doyan noted that this looks like something planned and not just an accident. Even if someone is a student at the academy, there are plenty of villains who intend to climb the Tower of Babel. Doyan continued that for them, the newcomers entering the tower are a great opportunity. By passing the entrance exam to the Great Academy, by killing an incoming first-year student, you undermine the reputation of the academy, but you get the position of the Tower Conqueror and even the coveted student card, so the position of the academy is clear. By saying that the attack of these intruders is a test that must be overcome, she completely absolves herself of responsibility. The professor was upset to hear such conclusions from Doyan. But Doyan continued that it seemed like the United Academy was just such a place. One only has to imagine that there are people who brazenly invade the tower that defines the purpose of the student's existence, but is unable to protect them from murder. Isn't this ridiculous for such an institution that claims to be the greatest of all dimensions? Yumina simply replied that everything happens for a reason, and that the academy has an obligation to protect its students. However, once they are inside the tower, this obligation becomes their responsibility. Moreover, if the tower chose an attacker instead of a student, the academy cannot interfere. Since this is the will of the tower, one cannot go against it. Hearing this, Doyan only replied that if that was really the case, then this place would become even more unpleasant to her. Doyan decided to leave to think things over alone. The professor tried to stop her, but Yuwan told her to try to understand Doyan because something disturbing happened inside the tower. Yuwan admitted that there was more to the tower besides traps and monsters. He noted that before leaving the tower, they met the constellation. The professor was extremely surprised to hear such a thing from Yuwan. The point is that the constellations are transcendental patrons, or simply observers. They monitor countless dimensions, and when they find someone they wish to favor, they make a contract with that person. These are transcendental beings that influence the dimension. Constellations provide powerful magic, special abilities, artifacts, and more to make others follow them. They demand a lot in return, but even so, few people refuse to enter into a contract with them. First of all, in a world where power is valued, there is nothing sweeter than their offer. Constellations are certainly attractive partners. Yuwan added that a strange voice, observer of all sights, spoke to him. The constellation promised power in exchange for fulfilling its demands. And although Yuwan said this with a sense of fear, the professor, on the contrary, was happy because they had the opportunity to make contact with the constellation on the very first day of their stay in the tower. For the first time in the history of the academy, establishing contact with a constellation so soon meant that their talents had already been recognized. But the students had a completely different opinion about this. Yuwan asked the professor if this was serious, and she answered with complete confidence that it was. The young man asked what the academy's position was regarding contracts with constellations. The professor responded that she officially declares her neutrality, but if the opportunity arises, she encourages students to take advantage of it. Yuwan realized that the academy was actually calling for their contracts rather than being neutral. The young man was surprised that in a place like the academy, There was no protection from intruders, but at the same time, there were creatures there that so little was known about. The professor asked what exactly the observer had asked him to do. Yuwan replied that in exchange for her power, she demands murder. Yumina asked Yuwan what he meant by that. He added that she promised to make a contract with the two of them who would kill the other two first. This was the requirement of the constellation for the conclusion of the treaty. The constellation said that only warm, blood-filled veins would carry songs and praise to her. And they are children with amazing potential, so she wants them to kill their comrade and give her his blood. Only then will she accept them as direct descendants of her branch. Until they reached the top of that tower and got what they wanted, her love would never leave them. And she wanted to start right now. Yuwan immediately thought it was crazy. Someone demanding to kill a friend just to gain power was complete nonsense. Doyan, on the other hand, walked forward and seemed to want to talk to the constellation. She didn't seem like herself at that moment, as if her darkest side had come out. Yumina guessed that Doyan must have released her energy. Yuwan replied that that was exactly it. She made the constellation disappear. Yuwan added that it was a creature that they couldn't even comprehend, treating their lives like toys, and it was disgusting to be subjected to such an ordeal. Due to the current situation, the tower will be closed until the end of the week. This was not good news for Yuwan, since he already has a sparring match with Erecto on Tuesday, so he can only spend the remaining time training. Yuwan also thought about writing a report on what happened in the tower using the footage from their camera and asked if the professor would be okay with it. She replied that it was possible and would also like to talk about it in more detail after having a bite to eat with everyone, but apparently that was not possible for now. Yuwan replied that yes, since after this turn of events everyone was a bit physically and mentally exhausted. The professor was concerned about the students and treated them with understanding. She added that they all did a great job and she was proud of them. Yumina will try her best to make sure nothing like that happens next week, and hopes that none of them will think anything bad about the academy. Enslave and Rushel thanked the professor and decided to go to their rooms. But Yumina asked Yuwan to stay a little longer if it wasn't too much trouble. The professor had another personal question for him, so she wanted to ask him directly. Yumina asked if the constellation hadn't just promised a contract to 2 of the 4, but had chosen him and Doyan specifically. Yuwan was amazed by the professor's insight and replied that it was exactly like that. It wasn't just an attempt to pit them against each other, but rather like sifting gold from sand. The constellation said that Doyan and Yuwan would definitely reach the top, but only if they get rid of Enslave and Rushel. She called them her beloved children and ordered them to kill her friends. Then she promised that they would be ahead of everyone, and only those with the brightest potential would remain. To kill and to seize is what real life is like according to the constellation. Upon returning to the room, Yuwan saw a dejected Enslave sitting with his knees folded. He tried to lighten the mood by asking him what he thought about the abilities of the other guys in the tower. But Enslave thought that Yuwan was teasing him for sitting in an unmanly manner. Yuwan replied that it wasn't like that. He hadn't even thought about it. Enslave apologized to him, saying that he needed to let off some steam, and that he didn't mind if Yuwan scolded him for it. Yuwan replied that he didn't intend to, but Enslave considered it another mockery and said that he wasn't even worth insulting. Yuwan didn't understand why Enslave was acting like this and where all his pride had gone. And suddenly, Enslave told Yuwan that he kind of hated him. The young man wanted to answer that he also hated him, but he thought about the consequences this would entail. Therefore, I decided to restrain myself so as not to start another conflict. The atmosphere in the room was tense. After the trip to the tower, the relationship between the guys worsened. Yuwan asked Enslave to tell him what was bothering him. Even if it was just a complaint, he would listen to everything. Enslave said that in the world he came from, he was one of the greatest talents. And this was not an exaggeration or wishful thinking. His family, his servants, absolutely everyone recognized and praised his talent. He was their hope for salvation. They also entrusted him with the sacred sword, and it was not just flattery, to receive the power of the Tower of Babel and become the last guardian to save them. Thanks to everyone believing in him, he was able to make a contract with the sacred sword and came to the academy with a burden of expectations from everyone. But what in the end? No matter what Enslave did, he became a burden to everyone. He was not considered a warrior and was treated as some kind of weakling. Yuwan told Enslave that she shouldn't take the constellation's words seriously because she was talking complete nonsense back then. But Enslave had a different opinion because it was Yuwan and Doyan that the constellation chose as potential talents and he and Rushel as worthless. Enslave repeated the professor's words that the constellations were transcendental beings, much stronger and smarter than people. And he didn't understand how Yuwan and Doyan could so easily refuse to sign a contract with them. His words shocked Yuwan because he definitely didn't expect to hear something like that from Enslave. He replied that such a proposal obviously made no sense to him. There were plenty of other ways to become strong without someone having to die, and neither he nor Enslave had come here to hear that. Enslave insisted, saying that Yuwan only thought that way because he had unrivaled talent. and perhaps if something had to be sacrificed to be chosen by the constellation, S-Light would hardly be able to refuse as decisively as Yuwan and Doyan. He might not have been able to make the same choice, but he would most likely have accepted her proposal. This made S-Light feel frustrated, scared, and unable to forgive himself. After such a cold dialogue, Yuwan decided to go take a warm shower. When they returned to the room, S-Light was already in his bed, and Yuwan thought that he had already fallen asleep. But S-Light still had something to add. He apologized to him for his whining. It wasn't Yuwan's fault. S-Light was just a little jealous of him. He apologized again for burdening him with uncomfortable stories. But Yuwan just smiled and said that everything was fine. After all, despite all the enmity and struggle for primacy, they are friends after all. His words touched S-Light, and he felt even more ashamed of what he had said earlier. Yuwan also added that he was always willing to listen to his stories. In the meantime, he would go out for a while and left him a mug of hot chocolate. If he wanted, he could have it. Finally, he said that the things you dislike the most are forgotten when you eat something delicious. Yuwan was surprised to see how much S-Light had changed since their first meeting, so he should be more careful with his words next time. Meanwhile, Doyan sneaked up on him. Doyan was glad to see that Yuwan had left the room on his own, and she wouldn't have to go in there. Yuwan was surprised to see her. After all, this was a male dormitory, and she definitely couldn't be here. But Doyan only answered him, "Not caught, not a thief." And she replied that he was right. This was not the best place for conversation. Doyan said that she found herself here while wandering around nearby, so she decided to come in. She was curious how the dead weight was doing, and if everything was okay with it. By dead weight, she meant S-Light. After all, according to her, he only knows how to swing a sword, pathetic without talent, and also without the ability to adapt. But Yuwan disagreed. He has talent, and he is skilled in fencing. Doyan said that all of this comes from his sword. That's the problem, and Yuwan himself understands this very well. His strong body, his sharp fighting instincts, his special abilities, all of this was due to the sword. Without it, he would be indistinguishable from a useless fool, Doyan thought. In addition, he can't even figure out what's going on. He's deeply unsure of himself, and at crucial moments he gets lost, turning into a fool. Yuwan realized that listing S-Light's shortcomings could drag on, so he asked her to stop. But she continued, adding that in a serious situation, if he lost his composure and spirit, it would all be over. At this rate, he will let down everyone who is nearby. Even Russell already feels weak, and if S-Light takes the same position, it will lead to bad consequences. Yuwan didn't understand what Doyan wanted in the end, to insult S-Light, or was he still worried about him? So he asked her what about her, how she felt after what happened. She's also been acting strange since she met the constellation and has been irritable around the professor. There's definitely nothing wrong with her. Doyan was a little embarrassed that Yuwan was worried about her. She even thought that he found out about it with his demon eyes ability. But Yuwan replied that he didn't need to use anything to understand. It was all written on her face. He just asked if she was okay, since he was also her friend. But Doyan took it as a simple consolation. She thanked him for his concern and replied that it was nothing serious. She was just a little irritated. Yuwan asked why. Was it because of the word constellation? She admitted that this was exactly it. Perhaps she was thinking the same thing as the constellation. Yuwan, of course, understood that Doyan was different from others. But hearing this from her directly, he was surprised. At that moment, Doyan was actually thinking about getting rid of S-Light and Russell. Yuwan didn't understand what kind of nonsense she was talking about, but Doyan continued. Perhaps that was why she was even more disappointed. If she had been more decisive and guided only by the idea of leaving the most capable ones nearby, completely immersed in herself, she would kill them, and even if not with her own hands, she would create the right conditions for this. At the same moment, she was angry at herself for the fact that she could agree to such a thing. For Yuwan, each conversation was more difficult than the other. He seemed to have a better understanding of the thoughts that guided his friends. After hearing this from Doyan, Yuwan said that by that logic, she could also be called stupid. Doyan didn't quite understand his words. After all, she told him her most intimate experiences, and in response, she received this. Yuwan continued that he thought S-Light and Russell were talented. No matter how incredible the artifact was, if they didn't have talent, they wouldn't have been able to get this far. S-Light certainly has a natural gift to be able to wield such a sword. The only problem is that due to his habit of relying too much on the sword, he cannot react to the situation in a timely manner. But he needs a lot of time to figure himself out. The same thing happens with Russell. Her incredible physical abilities and potential are only held back by her own internal contradictions. It won't be easy, but if they can overcome their problems on their own, their talent will surpass anything Doyan and Yuwan can imagine. Yuwan said this with his eyes shining, believing that one day S-Light and Russell would be equal in strength to Doyan. Doyan changed her mind about the guys and said that she would trust Yuwan. If they train, the results will speak for themselves sooner or later. Yuwan asked if that meant she was willing to help. Doyan agreed. And if, as he said, the two of them overcome their difficulties and grow, she would admit that Yuwan was right. However, if she is not satisfied with the result, the responsibility will fall on him. Yuwan was surprised and didn't quite understand what she was getting at. Doyan said it was because he made her put her own judgments aside and spend time on Enslave and Russell. So if he hasn't changed his mind, let him come to training tomorrow and take them with him. Yuwan didn't quite understand why tomorrow morning, since they had only just returned from the tower today. But one way or another, the next morning they were already at training. Yuwan and Russell watched in surprise as Doyan beat up Enslave. It seemed like she was just taking out all her anger on him. It seemed that there was no living space left on Enslave. Enslave asked Yuwan why this happened. After all, he promised to teach him something new, but in the end, only he gets it. Doyan didn't give Enslave even a minute to rest and told him to get up to continue training. She said that they were training their body now, and that's how they trained. After all, Enslave wasn't the type to change just by seeing something once, like Yuwan. Enslave asked to return his sword to him, but Doyan was categorically against it, until he learned to fight without it. He objected that he was a swordsman. What was the point of taking a sword from a swordsman? Doyan replied that in that case, if he lost the sword, he would simply die. Training with Doyan was truly unbearably hellish for Enslave. Yuwan told him that it was necessary for him to become stronger. He had agreed with Doyan about it beforehand, but he didn't expect it to turn out like this. So I asked him to trust them at least once and try to train without a sword. Enslave, of course, didn't want this, but he still agreed because he trusted Yuwan. And if he had a plan, then it really meant something. So he trusted him and tried to fight without his sword. Yuwan's words motivated Enslave, but it didn't last long. This was immediately followed by an unexpected blow from Doyan and words about how he was too open. Doyan continued to strike, and Enslave didn't even try to defend himself at this time. She told him that he must rely not only on his eyes to see her attacks, but also to feel them with all his senses. Enslave replied that he already understood that. Doyan noted that if he understood, then he should fix it right now, or his fighting instincts really were that dull without a sword. It was true right now. Enslave's stats were being artificially reduced in real time. Normally, it was a monster that could easily deal with a recto. But for some reason, when he's without his sword, his abilities seem to leak away. If these changes are indeed due to the sword, then Enslave's condition is worse than one might imagine. Doyan continued to hit and tell Enslave that he was worthless and getting weaker. He continued to deny it. She continued, "If you really think so, then prove it by looking me in the eyes and not at the sword you can't even hold." And suddenly something strange started to happen to Enslave. He finally managed to break Doyan's pace and attack her, albeit unsuccessfully. Yuwan and Russell, who were watching their sparring, were also surprised by Enslave's changes. His appearance changed to a woman's. Was this really what was hiding inside him all this time? A moment after that, something strange happened to his body again. It was as if everything inside him was burning and he looked like a time bomb. Yuwan ran to help him, worried about his comrade. But Doyan stopped him, saying that Enslave was okay, answering that what happened to him was not so easy to solve. Doyan wanted to make sure that Enslave knew what the problem really was. He replied that it was. He and Yuwan were right. He can't do this anymore either, so he's ready to spar again. Before that, Doyan wanted to apologize to him for being wrong about him. Enslave replied that it was not necessary, but Doyan continued, "I thought you were an ignorant fool, but if you think about it, you are a fool who carries a bomb on himself." Enslave already thought that she would praise him, but everything turned out the opposite. At this point, Russell suggested that Yuwan have a sparring match to keep up with them. But Yuwan was deep in thought at that moment and didn't notice Russell. With his eyes, he saw something strange. Enslave had both a holy and a demonic spirit. How could such contradictory concepts exist in one body? It looked like the reason for that outburst, but did Enslave understand it? He wanted to talk to him about it later in the dorm. Yuwan apologized to Russell for ignoring her. He was simply lost in his thoughts. The girl replied that everything was fine and suggested that they spar. He asked if everything would be okay, to which Russell replied that she didn't know, but he did have a way to stop her. But even if that was the case, Yuwan was still afraid of it. Russell noted that she also wants to learn to control her power and wants to be useful. Yuwan still agreed, but noticed that Russell seemed strangely motivated today. Was she really that shocked by yesterday? Still, sparring is sparring, and they will fight with wooden swords. Yuwan said that it was to set their own pace, and there was no need to be as noisy as Enslave and Doyan. So they will gradually increase the intensity. You can start. But suddenly Yuwan wondered, was this the life he dreamed of at university? The period of his youth as he imagined it was not a chaotic brawl full of aimless blows and gnashing of teeth. On the contrary, he thought that the young man and woman would encourage each other, honing their skills together. Yuwan thought he had hit the jackpot. Could it be that thanks to Russell, his dreams would come true? While he was lost in his thoughts, Russell thought that he was already ready for her to start attacking. And 5 minutes later, Russell was already bound by Eva's magical chains. It looks like she still has a long way to go before she learns to control her power. Russell asked if everything was okay and how many times she lost her temper. Yuwan replied that he lost count after the 10th time, but everything was okay. She apologized for this because now Yuwan looks beaten up solely because of her. But he replied that everything was fine because he himself promised that he would help. So he was prepared for it, so there's no need to be too upset about it. But their sweet conversation was interrupted by Doyan, who didn't really understand why they were flirting instead of training. Yuwan denied it, saying that he almost died, but in Doyan's eyes, it looked different. She thought that perhaps Russell had some ulterior motives. Doyan told Russell that training with her mind in the clouds was rude to her opponent. Therefore, such thoughts should be left aside during sparring. Yuwan noted that Russell, who was so motivated, was embarrassed again. Doyan was too strict with her. But no, considering what happened, isn't it amazing that Russell even had any motivation? If it had been Yuwan, he would have been so upset and the day would have been a total loss. Yuwan didn't think that Russell had time to improve her mental state, but she's trying her best. So he didn't continue to argue with Doyan to try to prove something to her. Yuwan said he recently asked the professor if he could take someone with him when he left the campus. She said yes. Doyan was sure that Yuwan would take her with him, but Yuwan had a different opinion and decided that from now on, he would take Russell outside the academy if she was okay with it. The other guys were extremely surprised by this, but the surprising decisions didn't end there. Yuwan asked Russell to go on a date with him. Yuwan and Russell went into town just to walk around a bit, and the first place they went to was a clothing store. Doyan and Enslave still continued to think that Yuwan was up to something strange, but he said that it wasn't so. Meanwhile, Russell had already chosen an outfit and went out to show it to Yuwan. The outfit was really stunning, bright, in the style of Rochelle. Yuwan also appreciated her and noted that she looked very beautiful, but Doyan and Enslave continued to be indignant. It was Russell's first time outside the academy, so everything was new to her. Yuwan suggested that they take a walk. There was a department store and a shopping area nearby, but Russell was so carried away by the beauty of the big city that she lost sight of it a little. Because of the crowd, it was difficult for her to reach Yuwan, and because of the noise, he couldn't hear her. However, Yuwan noticed in time that he had lost sight of Russell. He apologized, saying that he forgot that it was her first time in such a place, but Russell replied that everything was fine. To avoid getting lost in the crowd, they decided to hold hands, although it was a little embarrassing. Together, they continued to walk around the city and went into one of the food stalls to have a snack. Then they went to a toy store, where Russell chose a menacing penguin for herself. This walk was more than welcome after what happened in the tower. After a vigorous walk, they decided to have a snack at a local restaurant. It was a restaurant where all the ingredients were made from monster meat. And even though it was monster meat, the taste was amazing. Russell was shocked and couldn't believe that she was eating Ellen meat while in the city, all thanks to Yuwan. At this moment, Yuwan noticed Russell's strange behavior. Suddenly, she started to worry, and Yuwan asked what happened, if everything was okay. Russell responded that she felt too excited. For the first time in a long time, she visited the city. Yuwan gave her some beautiful clothes and treated her to delicious food. But she was worried because she couldn't do anything in return. Russell wondered if it was okay to enjoy life, since her stay here would hardly help her better control her abilities. Yuwan asked her to look at him for a second, or rather his palm, since Russell couldn't see the concept. He explained that the emotions she was feeling were formed above his hand. Until recently, his abilities had only detected anger from her, but now everything was different. In the short time they spent together, he was able to read even such short emotions. If they get closer and understand each other better, Yuwan is confident that they can find a solution to her problems with controlling her power. Can her ability to see these problems? Yes, but now she can't. Yuwan destroyed the concept of the emotion of excitement as an example of how Russell's problems would disappear. He promised to make sure her problems were resolved and hoped that today she would enjoy the moment without thinking about anything else. Russell was grateful to Yuwan. To her, everything he said seemed like magic that became truth. Yuwan thought that perhaps it was a burden for Russell that they were going out so suddenly, but she replied that it was fine. Russell also said that she would rather talk about how to get closer to her, but Yuwan didn't immediately understand what she meant. Russell added that she had talked about Doyan and wanted to be friends with her. Yuwan denied this, saying that there was nothing friendly about her. The girl replied that compared to others, Doyan might be scary to her and others, but it seems that Yuwan really likes Doyan. But the young man denied this, believing that she rather simply wanted to wield them, like a weapon or a blade. Yuwan's analogy was quite strange, so Russell laughed at it. Nevertheless, the girl felt much better after hearing this. She thought that Yuwan was an all-knowing wizard or something, but it seems that's not the case. This made her feel like she could try harder, but Yuwan didn't quite understand what she was talking about. Still, since Yuwan bought her a lot of clothes and gifts, it was now her turn to choose clothes for him. Yuwan simply couldn't refuse Russell, so he accepted her offer. He also told her not to think about the price, but rather to just enjoy it. Russell replied that dating such a capable man was a luxury, but Yuwan didn't quite understand what she meant. Meanwhile, things weren't very fun at the professor's meeting. The professor had an artifact camera with him. He tried to convince her that everything was fine and she needed to wait a little. At this time, in the teacher's office, they were watching the video recorded by Yuwan from their trip to the tower. They were outraged that such a video was posted on the intranet, thereby thoughtlessly spreading information about the tower. And no matter how Professor Yumina looks at it, Yuwan's independence has gone too far, and this is a clear encroachment on the authority of the academy. So one of the professors, Alex Canton, asked if Yumina was going to take responsibility for allowing the boy to do whatever he wanted. Yumina didn't expect things to turn out like this and was a little depressed. When she first saw the video, she thought that Yuwan had gone too far by filming inside the tower. When he said he was going to climb the tower and film it, she didn't pay attention because she thought it wouldn't work anyway. It was clear that artifacts or third-party devices could not function inside the tower, as magic would destroy them. That was obvious. However, he destroyed this obviousness and demonstrated the result. Perhaps Yuwan didn't even know about it. It wasn't that he brought the recording from the tower, but that he created a device that could work inside it, and that was amazing. But the laughs didn't end there, as Yuwan said he plans to post the video on his and his friend's channel. Yuwan thought it was a great way to get attention, since the rebellion group was a way to gain favor with other students. Yumina then asked him again if he was confident in his actions, since the information about the tower, which he had obtained with such difficulty, would be spread carelessly, and if he thought that he would regret it in the future. But Yuwan replied that other students were also suffering. Moreover, other than this artifact, there was no other way to make a recording, and it was like he was monopolizing the information. Some things, like the constellations, should be edited before publishing. The more information they share, the better it will be for everyone. At the time, she thought it was amazing because Yumina had already talked about the unfairness of the reality at the academy, but she never thought that Yuwan would resolve it in such a way. So she just asked him to be careful and remember that there could be consequences for this. To this, Yuwan responded that, as she had already said, it was unclear what changes, big or small, this would bring. So they need to strengthen their position quickly, because wouldn't the professors be more at ease knowing that they are okay? Yumina couldn't imagine that one of Yuwan's intentions would be so unusual and wonderful. The professor also told him that if he wanted to be safe, he should avoid accidents. And it seems that what he created will lead to the emergence of something grandiose, capable of bridging the gap between dimensions. Perhaps this is why the professor feels he wants to trust and help the young man. When another professor asked Yumina if she was ready to take on responsibility, she answered confidently, "Filming and publishing a video from the tower is his personal business. What the problem is, and who, in the opinion of the teachers, is to blame, she understands." Therefore, Professor Canton's question remains unclear to Yumina. To her words, he replied that even her lies were beautiful, and was it really only he who thought that Yuwan was being treated specially? But another professor named Thalia Liliana Campanella intervened in the conversation. She was a professor in the artifact creation department and asked Yumina not to frame her, but to just answer honestly who Yuwan really was. Yumina replied that he was just a student, but she was interrupted by the professor of combat aura, Ryu Chulmyung. He pointed out that since he was just a student, this was unacceptable and there was a limit to everything. Yumina knew that the information about the tower was the most important. He added that such behavior was a violation of the academy's rules, but Yumina replied that he was saying strange things. After all, the reason no one had filmed in the tower until now was because no one had the ability to do so. So it was better to think about how they could use the student. Professor Canton asked her what this ability was and what the principle of its operation was, and whether she could explain it so that everyone present would understand. Professor Talia did not remain silent either. She noted that she had been working at the academy for 200 years. Artifacts created outside the tower do not work inside, especially the high-precision equipment needed for filming. No circuit could withstand the waves of mana emitted by the tower. The more she studied it, the more she became convinced that such a thing was impossible. Therefore, according to the professor, this is an inevitable law that cannot be denied. But despite this, Yumina says that Yuwan managed to do it somehow. Talia says that's exactly what she's asking about, isn't it? A boy from the netherworld, without mana. How can that be explained? And it's as if there is only one way to find out the truth. To do this, Professor Talia required the artifact that captured the video. Talia was determined to take it apart and find out what technology Yuwan was using. But Yumina replied that she had to refuse Talia because she asked for permission to take the artifact with her, but it was an achievement created by a student. Therefore, she could not allow anyone to do anything with it. Other professors began to see this as a rebellion against them and a refusal to cooperate. And then another professor, known for his bad temper, intervened in the conversation. It was the head of the constellation department at Babylon, Professor Zeno Yuwan, the vice-rector of the academy. He asked his colleagues to calm down and refrain from speaking. He thanked Professor Thalia for her research and efforts over the past 200 years. Thalia's confidence and loudness instantly disappeared when the academy's vice-rector spoke. Zeno also asked if even a professor with such incredible authority in the field thought Yuwan's artifact was special. Thalia replied that it was, and she didn't know why. The professor replied that it must be too hard for other professors to accept this fact. The colleagues did not immediately understand what the vice-rector was talking about. Zeno said that in short, Yuwan is the only one in the world who has been recognized as a tower. The professors reacted violently to Zeno's statement, calling it a frivolous statement. After all, Yuwan had only just entered the tower for the first time the day before yesterday, so he could be recognized by it. Many considered his statement reckless, despite the fact that he is the vice-rector. Zeno replied that they had the right to decide whether to believe him or not, but there was another reason to consider him special. He asked Yuwan if the professors could be persuaded if they shared facts that were not in the video. Without waiting for her answer, Zeno declared in front of the professors that Yuwan and his classmates were the only ones among those conquering the tower who were chosen by the constellations. This caused an even more violent reaction. How could a guy who had just entered the tower for the first time yesterday be chosen as a constellation? Yuwan asked Zeno to be careful in his statements, since contact with the constellation is a personal achievement of the student. Zeno replied that in that case, let him answer honestly. He was asking as the vice principal whether Yuwan and his classmates had signed a contract with the constellation. Yuwan didn't understand why the vice principal was going so far, and replied that no one had made a contract with the constellation. As Zeno had suspected, they were not quite ordinary to have refused the contract. He added that it must have been difficult for them to show their intentions due to the pressure of the constellation's presence. In that case, the vice principal will invite Yuwan and all the 11th grade students to attend his lecture. The professors reacted violently to his statement again, because he himself heard that none of the students had signed a contract with the constellation, so why were they receiving assistance in the form of attending higher-level lectures? Zeno replied that it didn't matter whether they had made a contract with the constellation or not, but that they had been chosen by it. He added that being chosen by a constellation already proves their exclusivity. From the moment they refuse the contract, other constellations will obviously show interest in them. So Zeno asks his colleagues, aren't these the students who should be receiving help from his lectures? He is a professor who teaches the students who were chosen by the constellation, and if Yuwan was chosen, he is also his student. Now it was time to move on to the agenda regarding the recent leak of the interior filming in the tower. For their part, they couldn't force anything on Yuwan. And as far as his abilities are concerned, personal requests and questions will be allowed. But if in the process it turns out that someone is putting pressure on the student or causing him inconvenience, anyone who participates in this, whether a professor or a student, will be expelled from the academy. Yuwan realized that this meeting was not about how to bully Yuwan, but on the contrary, the vice principal's words expressed the rector's intentions. This was the rector's warning to the faculty, do not touch Yuwan. Now knowing this, Zeno asked the professors to keep this in mind. At this point, the meeting was concluded, and he hoped that everyone would have a good rest of the week. Yuwan never thought that Yuwan would be able to win the principal's favor so strongly. Meanwhile, Professor Canton suggested that Yuwan go to the bar and have a couple of cocktails, if she didn't mind, of course. He also added that he wanted to toast to Yuwan's success, but Professor Yumina's gaze said it all. She wasn't interested, so Yuwan simply ignored him. Professor Canaton was upset that Yuwan ignored him, but his other colleagues invited him to go out for a drink with them. The next day, the entire academy already knew the name Yuwan. Many students began to notice him and did not let him pass by. Some wanted to meet him, some invited him to the student council, and some were interested in where he was from. But Yuwan didn't quite understand why there was so much interest in him. Doyan was also surprised to see this and asked the boys what happened. Enslave responded that the thing is, that after they posted the video of the tower climb on their channel crossed the 2 million subscriber mark, and the video itself gained over 5 million views. So now it's quite difficult to find someone who doesn't know about their channel. Doyan didn't think that compared to his other abilities, filming would be so impressive. Yuwan's ideas and abilities are truly outstanding, and watching people's reactions was even more interesting. This also interested Russell in its own way. Friends were happy for Yuwan. It must be great to feel like a celebrity. It's much better than getting into arguments with everyone. Besides, they have a lot of fans now, and if someone talks to them, you have to be kind, especially to Doyan. Meanwhile, behind their backs they were already being discussed in a bad light. It was the same trio that had been bothering Russell, and now they were discussing how the video was actually a montage. After all, they went through 4 rooms so quickly in such a short time, and the size of the spider, in their opinion, is clearly a montage. They also continued to say that tomorrow their blatant lies would be exposed. The thing is that tomorrow is the sparring match between Yuwan and Erecto. Yuwan was sure that those who doubted the video or still disliked him were looking forward to tomorrow when Erecto would destroy him. But his friends believed in him and said that he could win. Doyan noted that in that case, Yuwan would simply be able to live up to those expectations as best she could and support them. The day of sparring arrived. Yuwan, although a little nervous, was more or less confident of his victory thanks to the support of his friends. The duel will be broadcast live on the official school channel, and the teacher asked if the students were okay with it. Without a doubt, yes. The professor added that if they agreed, they just needed to sign the document. Yuwan didn't quite understand why such precautions were necessary. The document stated that if one of the participants was unable to continue or gave up, the duel would be considered over. Hitting vital points is forbidden, but injuries are inflicted at one's own risk, as if they are telling them to hit until they become crippled. Erecto called him a negotiator and asked if he was afraid of him. Yuwan was surprised when he called him that. Did he really subscribe to their channel? Erecto continued to say that if he was afraid, he could just give up. But only if he crawls between his legs and barks like a dog. Only then will he accept his defeat. Yuwan was shocked by this statement, and it seemed that Erecto was extremely serious about the fight. Although Yuwan became popular thanks to his videos on the channel, many still hated him for being a creature from the underworld. Meanwhile, Doyan, Enslave, and Russell were checking to make sure everything was okay with the YouTube broadcast. At the same time, they were interested in reading what other viewers wrote about Yuwan. The number of viewers on the stream exceeded 10,000, but most of the comments were insulting him. Doyan noted that this was to be expected, since the number of people who liked them based on their best videos could be counted on the fingers of one hand. So now that so many people are watching them, there is no other option but to prove your competence. And whether Yuwan is talented enough to reach the top or not, he must show his best side today. Meanwhile, Yuwan was pondering over Erecto's words. He never thought that he would hear something that sounded more like cheap show-off from a third-rate novel. But he didn't want to look third-rate in comparison, so he responded to Erecto's offer in a rather rude manner. This made Erecto even more angry, and he asked Yuwan how long he could pretend to be so calm. But Yuwan replied that whether he was pretending or not, Erecto could check for himself. These words made Erecto even more angry, and he was already impatiently waiting for the moment when the professor would announce the beginning of the duel. Since both participants were ready, it was time to begin the sparring match between Erecto from Class 1 and Yuwan from Class 11. As soon as the professor said this, Erecto immediately rushed into attack. Yuwan didn't expect such a quick attack from him. But thanks to the training and experience gained in the tower, he dodged his blow without much difficulty. And then he deftly counterattacked. No matter how you look at it, Erecto's dimensions were off the charts, and this greatly affected his speed. Yuwan was able to punch Erecto right in the face when he didn't expect it. The blow was so powerful that he fell to the ground. For Yuwan, fighting face-to-face with such a boulder was most effective using the method he had recently learned. Just the day before the sparring, after a date with Russell, the whole group went to training. Doyan wanted to teach him a new technique, but before she began, she noted that the technique allowed for quite a bit of trial and error. The thing is that it is good for an inexperienced user, because when meeting a new opponent, you need to be able to use his own attacks against him, and only then can you say that he has mastered the theory. Therefore, Yuwan had to constantly train to apply this method in any situation. Doyan was going to attack him with a club, constantly changing the speed and strength of her blows. If he could withstand such an onslaught at least once, it would already be a good result. Although Yuwan himself did not share her opinion at the time. Either way, the technique actually worked. If he did it right, Erecto wouldn't even be able to reach him. Erecto didn't even understand what happened and how Yuwan managed to attack him. But it wasn't just a punch to the face. There was something special about it. Before striking, Yuwan imbued the sword with wave energy, and it seemed that Erecto's stone body was excellent at conducting such energy. Erecto was amazed at how strong Yuwan actually was, but he didn't want to admit it and continued to blabber on about how this young man dared to damage his body. To this, Yuwan only replied that he should stop talking and start fighting, and if he had already had enough of one blow, then he might as well finish it. These words made Erecto lose his temper, and in anger he tried to hit Yuwan, but he dodged again. Erecto's emotions got the better of him. He was no longer in control of himself from anger and hated the look with which, in his opinion, some upstart from the underworld was looking down on him. Then he used his technique, which greatly increased the force of his hand strike. He hit the ground with all his might, trying to hit the young man. Yuwan didn't understand why Erecto was acting so stupidly. He had already done this kind of attack. Didn't he want to try something else? But Erecto was so angry that he didn't care. He just wanted to kill the boy. Erecto continued to chase him around the arena, trying to land at least one hit. However, Yuwan's speed was a level higher, and yet if he continued to attack the same way without taking any countermeasures, all that was left for Yuwan to do was counterattack. In other words, he had no choice but to counter Erecto in the same manner. His blow was much more powerful and painful than the previous one. It seemed that he injured his opponent's hand. Zeno also watched this fight, but the match seemed pointless to him. Meanwhile, the opinions of the commentators changed dramatically. No one could believe that Erecto was so easily inferior in strength to Yuwan. Compared to how Yuwan was when he first entered, he has become much stronger now. The ardent haters couldn't believe their eyes. Was Erecto really that weak? They even began to think that the video on the Vosteni channel was actually real and not just a good edit. The professor was also perplexed. Just a week ago, the boy was no match for him. And now he looked like a real warrior. How did the young man manage to achieve this in a few days? At that moment, he received an urgent message directly from the professor's meeting. Yuwan didn't know what to do. Attacking someone who couldn't even move due to injuries would look pathetic. If Erecto wants to continue the fight, he needs to get up or he will lose. But the professor announced the end of the sparring by the decision of the observers, without a winner, since Erecto was deemed incapable of continuing the fight. This caused a strong reaction from everyone. The professor added that in order to protect both participants, the sparring was ended. Yuwan didn't want to accept this outcome. He was sure that if he was the one being beaten, the professor would continue the fight until he died. So the young man wanted to clarify something, but the professor only replied that objections were not accepted. He also demanded that Yuwan leave the circle, which he did not agree with. However, the young man still retreated, but it seemed strange to him that the fight ended in such a way, without allowing the winner to be determined. Even though the situation was unpleasant, Yuwan didn't look like a loser, which means it can be considered that the victory was his. But suddenly Yuwan heard the professor's screams as he tried to stop Erecto. Despite the fight being over and being deemed unable to continue, Erecto still rose to continue the fight. He felt it was unacceptable to kneel before someone like Yuwan and didn't want to end it all with his own shame. A huge boulder rushed towards Yuwan, completely ignoring the professor's words. He realized that it would be impossible to stop Erecto and asked Yuwan to dodge. But Yuwan had a different opinion. Why dodge if you can give a worthy rebuff? Moreover, Erecto seriously intends to kill him, so why can't he respond in kind? He heard the professor's order to stop, but he probably thought that since Yuwan was from the lower dimension, he could be ignored. And the teachers who themselves encouraged the fight and then stopped it on a whim, Yuwan wanted to answer everyone at once. The Academy's methods were beginning to seriously irritate him. With a powerful blow, Yuwan cut off Erecto's right arm. The pain was so intense that it seemed that Erecto's scream could be heard beyond the Academy's dimension. The spectators were shocked by what they saw. This usually doesn't happen in sparring. The professor begged Erecto to calm down, saying that his arm could be restored, while Yuwan received a message window. He was faced with a choice: take the concepts from the severed hand or stop. Yuwan did not expect that this was even possible. Meanwhile, the professor was hastily trying to send Erecto to the medical center and ordered him not to move. After that, he began to scold Yuwan for not dodging even though he was clearly told to. Yuwan apologized, explaining that everything happened too suddenly and he couldn't react differently. The professor became furious, not considering such words as repentance. At this point, the vice-rector of the academy intervened in the conversation. Zeno asked Professor Farrell to calm down and let him sort out the situation himself. He introduced himself to Yuwan as the vice principal of the academy and said that they saw everything. From now on, he would start asking questions, so Yuwan had to answer honestly. He couldn't refuse. Zeno asked about Erecto's reckless attack. After all, the young man would not claim that he could not dodge. With his abilities, he could easily avoid the blow. The vice-rector added that due to the difference in strength, he and the professors decided to end the fight. Now they wanted to hear from Yuwan an explanation for what he had done. The professor wondered why he didn't dodge the attack. Yuwan remembered that he had recently gained the ability to use the power of words, but he had never really thought about what it meant. But despite this, the question coming from the screen made him feel uneasy. Even from here, Yuwan felt a monstrous pressure and couldn't imagine who the vice principal really was. Yet he dared to reply that he had not dodged Erecto's attack and instead counterattacked on a whim. He simply believed that a student who ignored the authority of a professor and acted as he pleased should suffer the consequences. The vice-rector asked again whether he had misheard what Yuwan had said about the authority of professors. The young man added that, in addition, in an official sparring match, where the rules must be strictly observed, he wanted to make sure that no one else would break them. Zeno asked why he thought so. Yuwan replied that many students and spectators from other dimensions were watching the sparring. Despite this, Erecto ignored the announcement of the end of the fight and attempted to kill him. He noted that if he had reacted passively, it would have shown that rules could be relaxed when dealing with a student from the lower world. Since there was little time to think, he considers his actions justified, and he acted exclusively in accordance with the principles of the academy. Zeno noted how resourceful Yuwan was responding, knowing full well that many people were currently watching their conversation. He had transferred the problem between the two people to the entire academy, and the situation could no longer be ignored. However, there was one more thing. Zeno admitted that Yuwan's words were true. Students who disregard the rules of sparring deserve appropriate punishment. But still, punishing students for their misdeeds is the job of the academy and the teachers, and not the business of people like him. It turns out that Yuwan lost in this verbal battle, but he was not going to back down. Professor Farrell believed that it didn't matter what nonsense Yuwan talked, because his opponent was the vice-chancellor himself. Yuwan agreed that if his actions had encroached on the professor's authority, then he offered his deepest apologies. The young man added that in any case, he was ready to be punished for what he had done. But the vice-rector simply replied that everything was fine and that he was not going to discuss the punishment. This surprised both Yuwan and Professor Farrell. Zeno added that he was simply curious about what the young man was thinking when he did this. And with this, he showed that Yuwan had the determination and eloquence to gain the favor of the constellation. In the end, he stated that the fault lay with Erecto, who ignored the end of the match and attacked. That is why Zeno and other professors consider the student's self-defense to be justified. Professor Farrell tried to object to the vice-chancellor, but he ordered him to stop his disgraceful behavior. After all, if he had stopped the raging Erecto in time, nothing would have happened. Therefore, he will also have to bear responsibility. Finally, the vice-rector added that sewing Erecto's arm back on was not such a difficult task, so the sparring could end there. Among the students, of course, there were those who did not want to accept such an outcome. On the contrary, Yuwan's friends were glad that everything ended peacefully. The vice principal asked the students to return to their seats and focus on their studies. He also noted that Yuwan had done well and could also be free. In the end, Zeno said that they would meet again. This made Yuwan wary because he did not understand what exactly he meant. Returning to his friends, he thanked them for their support. They discussed sparring together, and Enslave noted that the boss fights in the tower had clearly done Yuwan some good. Doyan also admitted that she enjoyed watching the duel. Yuwan became stronger. She was interested in how his new power felt and how useful it was. Yuwan joked that it was all thanks to secret training with her, but Doyan meant something else. The girl spoke of Erecto's hand, which he cut off and absorbed. Yuwan tensed up a little when she brought it up, but he honestly admitted that yes, at the moment when he cut off his hand, he did not think about the consequences. And I didn't even imagine that I would be able to obtain new concepts in this way. Just in case, he took a little bit and opened two concepts, giant and volcano, which people cannot possess. And it really worked, because before he couldn't control the concepts of living beings at will, and now it looks like it will be able to absorb specific parts, cutting them off. In this way, he managed to absorb Erecto's right arm. Doyan didn't understand why Yuwan was talking about this with a gloomy expression when everything turned out well. He explained that at first he was happy about his new power, but when he came to his senses, he realized that he had cut off the hand of a man, not a monster. And remembering the joy of the acquired power, he felt strange and uncomfortable. Doyan simply waved her hand, saying that he was talking nonsense and advised him to keep his head up. After all, Erecto tried to kill him, so the retribution of losing his arm is more than fair. He won. Erecto lost, that's all. Her words pleasantly surprised Yuwan. Doyan added that it doesn't matter who his opponents are. If someone tries to take your life, their fate is already sealed. Her words brought Yuwan back to reality, and he apologized to his friends for his dark thoughts. Worrying about something like that was really stupid. Doyan smiled and remarked what would happen if she walked around the special classroom and cut off the hands there. These words immediately scared Yuwan. Enslave quickly reassured his friend, saying that unlike Doyan, he was still a human. Doyan didn't appreciate the joke, and it seemed like she and Enslave were about to have another fight. At that moment, Yuwan received a strange letter. His reaction was so violent that his friends began to worry about him. It turned out to be a mandatory lecture from Zeno with no right to refuse. Professor Zeno's additional course, Constellations of Babylon, is only for seniors, 4th and above. In it, he tells how to properly attract the support of the constellations, conduct negotiations, and also shares other useful knowledge and explains how to avoid the wrath of the constellations and make a smooth transition from one to another. On the way to the classroom, they heard other students whispering behind their backs. Yuwan was called a salesman who talked a lot and stuck up his nose. The older students were surprised at what the 11th grade students were doing here, since this was a place for seniors only. As they walked towards the auditorium, Yuwan wanted to say something. He noted that there was a rumor in their world that the more you were cursed, the longer you lived. Doyan joked that in that case, Yuwan was destined for immortality. Russell was worried about him after yesterday, fearing that now even more people would hate him. After all, everyone judges by rumors without even knowing who he really is. But Yuwan assured her that everything was fine and there was nothing to worry about. He thanked her for her concern, but added that she shouldn't worry about it. Doyan suspected something was wrong. After their weekend outing, Russell and Yuwan seemed to be on the same wavelength. She pointed out that maybe it was because of the gifts he had given her, and if she was going to court him, she should do it somewhere else. Russell responded without hesitation that perhaps it was just jealousy. These words touched Doyan, and she was about to use force. But now was no time for quarrels. They had approached the audience, and it was time to go in. Light warned Yuwan that there had already been a similar lecture last week, and it was unknown how the seniors would react if newcomers from the lower dimensions suddenly appeared. Yuwan was also a little worried, but he tried to remain optimistic. He hoped that the elders would think that promising younger students had joined them, but his hopes were not justified. Few of the elders were happy about their appearance. These seniors were very different from the other students. Even Doyan couldn't ignore their strength. Just one look from them put a lot of pressure on them. Even Yuwan couldn't help but activate his eyes to find out more about them. Professor Zeno greeted the juniors and was glad to see them at his lecture. As expected, the lecture hall was a place for gifted students, but not to that extent. Yuwan couldn't read a single concept. They were all beyond his understanding. The professor began the lecture and brought the children up to speed, explaining that the purpose of this lecture was simple: to understand the origin of the tower and the constellations. Since they are joined by younger students today, they will first talk about the tower. At first glance, the tower looks like a huge structure without beginning or end, but in reality, it is indistinguishable from a living organism. As they climb the tower, they overcome challenges and discover hidden treasures and secrets within. It looks like they get rewards by clearing the rooms, but it's not that simple. They don't find the rewards. The tower has them ready for them to get to choose the most outstanding conquerors among them. With the best items, exceptional treasures, thanks to an incredible miracle, the tower itself seeks those who seek to know and understand themselves. It is best to reveal secrets to someone who is capable of understanding them. This is the basic condition for any intelligent being predisposed to a higher level of thinking. Yuwan had already accumulated enough questions in such a short period of time. Zenon's lecture seemed pointless to him. Just because of one intruder, the tower system was turned upside down. How alive and thinking is she then, if she chooses her conquerors herself? This seemed too strange to the young man. However, if you think about it, the moment when the rector's letter was sent out en masse happened shortly after the intruder entered the tower. Therefore, they assumed that the spider swarm phenomenon in the fourth room was caused by an uninvited guest. But if you think about it, the oddity was already felt from the first room. The thing that instantly killed Russell was clearly elite. If the tower only started acting strange after they got to that room, then the difficulty of the first, second, and third remains inexplicable. Yuwan couldn't understand what was really going on. The professor said that the tower is actually indistinguishable from a living organism, and this may serve as a wild guess. But what if we change the conditions of the passage? We can assume that the difficulty has changed, not because of the invader. It changed because they started to rise. The difficulties from the beginning were caused by the fact that the tower thinks for itself, and perhaps that is why it put them there. Or maybe it was because Yuwan, the descendant of the tower's master, had begun his ascent. These thoughts turned everything upside down in Yuwan's head. He no longer understood where the truth was and where the lie was. Watching him, Professor Zeno also noticed something strange about the young man. Yuwan continued to think, if the tower thinks and chooses climbers as the professor said, then there will be no better moment. After all, their class faces challenges and situations that are unlike any other. As has been said, high risk comes with high reward. The rewards that the tower has in store should be on a whole other level. Yuwan was also worried that he still couldn't master the concept that was taught in the classroom. And suddenly Zeno asked him if he had managed to master it, the concept of a barrier around. He noted that some students do not notice it even after years. But finding this sphere on the first day is quite good. Zenon praised Yuwan for his intuition. Zeno also added that, as expected, as first years, they fully met the requirements needed to take this lecture. In this regard, the professor had one small question for Yuwan. Zeno asked the young man what he saw in this sphere. But Yuwan couldn't see anything. Everything seemed unknown and beyond his comprehension. So he honestly answered the professor that he saw nothing. Zeno asked him to concentrate a little better and try again. But nothing worked anyway. The professor continued to insist that he try to concentrate again. He had to see something in this sphere to unlock its secret. And suddenly, Yuwan managed to see something that he had already encountered before. Inside the sphere, he saw the concepts: barrier, gap, and protection. But unfortunately, for now it all looked like he couldn't absorb it. The professor thanked him and told him to stop and rest a little. Zeno was not mistaken. The young man really is unusual. He had just managed to reveal the three main abilities of the sphere. Now it became clear to Zeno why the rector was keeping such an eye on Yuwan. The professor asked Yuwan if he understood what this sphere was. Yuwan answered honestly that he didn't understand anything yet. Zenon noted his honesty, but said that it would be better if he thought about it a little more. The professor wanted to emphasize to everyone, both in class and in everyday life, the power of thinking and the development of imagination are important. because the expansion of thinking is directly related to the growth of strength. Therefore, if students want to use their skills at a more advanced level, they need to develop the power of thought, their driving force. Yuwan didn't quite understand what was going on and asked the professor if someone with high cognitive abilities would be able to control the sphere. Zeno replied that everything was correct. That is why it is so important to develop thinking. Even if the answer does not come immediately, you cannot stop thinking. Once you understand the structure of all things, analyze them and learn to think big. This sphere can turn a person into a kind of pseudo-god. But Yuwan still didn't fully understand what exactly the professor was talking about. Zeno noted that this may be difficult to understand now, but as the lectures progress, the understanding will come on its own. This is the core material of his course, also related to the main lecture, Modeling the War of the Constellations. This concluded today's lecture, and as an assignment, the professor asked them to imagine possible uses for the sphere. And yet, Yuwan found it difficult to understand all this, despite the professor's explanations. If this is God, then what is a pseudo-god? A being similar to God, or a false god? These thoughts did not give the young man any peace. Enslave suggested that the boys return to the dorm, but Yuwan kept thinking about the principle of becoming a god. Perhaps it is difficult to understand because they are freshmen, and the lecture is too difficult. On the way back, Yuwan asked the boys if someone could explain the lecture material again. Enslave was surprised to hear it from him, because he thought that Yuwan would summarize everything for the others himself. Suddenly they encountered Ortima, the very same rival of Doyan. Yuwan asked him what he was doing there, but the proud Ortima only wanted to know where Doyan was. The guys didn't quite understand what he was talking about and why he suddenly needed Doyan. She lagged behind them a little on the way and came up a little later, surprised to see that everyone was huddled together. Doyan thought something big had happened, but luckily it was just Ortima. As he himself said, he came to her on special business. Doyan thought that he wanted to have another duel, a so-called rematch. She told him that if that was the case, then if he wanted to die, she would not stop him. However, this was not a desire for a duel. Ortima had completely different intentions. Ortima came here to ask her out on a date. The boys were surprised to see the ruler of the dimension inviting Doyan to go for a walk. Yuwan didn't understand what kind of person you had to be to fall in love with a woman who beat you half to death. Enslave noticed that Yuwan had answered his own question, hinting at it. But Doyan believed that Ortima was simply plotting some kind of plan against her. The boys were surprised to hear this, because it didn't sound like a sinister plan at all. Doyan was sure he had an ulterior motive. There was no trace of affection in his gaze. Yuwan countered that it wasn't like that at all. Maybe it was because she was beautiful. Doyan didn't understand how Yuwan could say such embarrassing things so casually. At this time, Russell began to think, what if there really was no catch? After all, at that moment, Ortima didn't look like he was planning anything bad. At the time, he seemed sincere, but Doyan decided that he was up to something and replied that she was not interested in him. At that moment, Ortima really looked depressed. It seemed that this was not the answer he expected to hear from her. Meanwhile, the boys continued to train. Yuwan discovered new concepts, charm and honor, after he uploaded them to his channel. His charm allowed him to enchant and influence others. However, he still did not understand how this would help him advance in the tower. Yuwan asked Russell if his face had changed recently. She didn't quite understand what he meant and said that she thought he looked very attractive, but that wasn't quite what he wanted to clarify. Hearing their conversation, Doyan became furious again. She reminded them that during training, they should concentrate, and during rest periods, they should rest, not fool around. Yuwan asked Doyan if his face was okay, but she told him to focus on training and not on stupid things. Yuwan continued to train with Russell, helping her control her power. With such training, he wanted to establish her control over the animal part. Enslave noted that Yuwan had indeed gotten stronger and suggested that perhaps they should stop focusing on dungeons and move on. But Doyan replied that although he had become stronger, he was still far behind her and Russell. Their training together was only successful because one of them acted gently towards the other. In any case, tomorrow they were planning to head out to the tower again. Doyan was interested in whether Yuwan had managed to figure out what to do with Russell, since the pace of the campaign was no different from last week. If they fail to find a solution quickly, they will face the same thing again as last time. Over the past week, while observing Russell, Yuwan noticed several things. Her heart was driving her crazy, and any emotion became fuel for her. Her state changed dramatically depending on what emotion fueled her. If negative emotions served as food, she burned more and more and lost control of herself. And when it was fueled by calm and positive feelings, the riot subsided and the emotions stabilized. In combat, strong emotions inevitably intensify, making a state of rage almost inevitable. But if Yuwan can change the fuel to something positive, it might work. And now he needed to test this theory in practice. He finally managed to calm Russell down, at least for a while, and stop her continuous attacks. He had spent the past week not having fun, but trying to find a way to help her. Spending time with her, he collected her emotions when she was happy, having fun, or feeling calm. These were not artificially created feelings, but copies of her own emotions. Now Yuwan intended to use them as fuel for Russell, hoping that it would help. At least, that's what he hoped for, and he believed it would work. But the theory turned out to be much simpler than the practice, and Yuwan failed to make Russell absorb the positive emotions. On the contrary, she became even more aggressive and counterattacked him. Having knocked him to the ground without much effort, she became more and more furious, like a wild animal. Doyan and Enslave rushed to his aid, and at that moment, Yuwan used Eva to grab Russell with chains. Miraculously, he managed to survive, but who knows what could have happened if he had thought for a second. However, Yuwan noticed that Russell seemed to have returned to normal faster than she could have been chained. It turns out that there was progress, and this was pleasing, but waiting for it every time was too dangerous. There were definitely changes, but it's not clear what exactly. Russell thanked Yuwan, although he didn't quite understand why. He replied that it was too early to thank them, because they had not solved the problem completely. But she said that she could now fight with peace of mind. It was a big step for her, and she was glad that Yuwan was there, but their conversation was interrupted by Doyan again. Yuwan, as always, was tensed when he saw her so close, but everyone was glad that no one was seriously hurt. However, Doyan noticed some strange change in Russell. For some reason, she decided to remain silent, only saying that training was over for today. Russell was alarmed by the fact that Doyan seemed to want to say something, but changed her mind. The next day they went to the tower, and Enslave wondered why he couldn't take the sword with him. Doyan explained that they had agreed together to build a solid foundation without rushing. After all, this was only their second research in the first semester, so Enslave shouldn't worry. But he was still worried, and Yuwan noted that the more he used the holy sword, the more it depended on him. The concept of a demon combined with a holy spirit no longer gave Yuwan the confidence that it was truly a holy sword, so it was better to keep Enslave away if that weapon had a negative effect on him. Enslave said that if he fell into the tower because of this, he shouldn't be blamed. Doyan replied that they wouldn't blame him. They would just make him suffer even more. Before the trip, Yuwan decided to review his characteristics once again. Compared to what he had before, he has now become several times stronger. He also prepared Eva and Taiki, living artifacts that are integral parts of his power. Before the trip, Russell told Yuwan that she would do her best not to lose control and would listen carefully to everything he said. Yuwan noted that he was indeed strong in a real fight, and Russell naturally believed him. Doyan wanted to clarify a few things with him before they left. She reminded him that the first assessment would take place today, and frankly, she was disappointed with Enslave and Russell, unless he had forgotten about the promise he made to her. Yuwan replied that he remembered and added that they had both already started changing, so there was no need to expect immediate results. Everything would be as he said. However, Doyan was worried about Russell, especially about what she was going to say yesterday. Russell tried to eavesdrop on their conversation without being noticed, but Doyan noticed it without any difficulty. She used some technique to muffle Russell's hearing. A strange ringing sound began in Russell's ears that only she could hear. Doyan asked Yuwan if he knew what submissiveness was. He replied that it was when someone was dominated. She countered that this was not entirely true. From the perspective of the one being dominated, it might feel uncomfortable, but some people find stability in strong, firm leadership. In this sense, according to her, Russell really likes someone who is able to completely control and subjugate her. Yuwan didn't quite understand where Doyan was going with this, so she decided to speak directly. When the beast becomes uncontrollable, empty talk is useless. But even so, Yuwan still didn't understand what she was talking about, and this irritated Doyan quite a bit. She said that if he doesn't understand, then at least let him remember her words. The boys had no time to think. Right now, they had to try to conquer the tower again. Yuwan called this the second sortie of the special selection freshmen and told everyone to get ready. The new room was very different from the previous ones, not only in appearance, but also in terms of pressure. If before the rooms resembled caves, now everything looked like another planet with a view of space. Doyan was even a little confused, deciding that they would start from the first room. However, this place did not look like a starting area at all. A labyrinth awaited them. Yuwan noted that, judging by the pendant, they were currently on the 5th floor. And yet, despite the fact that it was only the 5th floor with a labyrinth, the oddities did not end there. Yuwan noticed that Russell started to act strangely, walking to the side, ignoring the others. Russell said that she felt a monster nearby and asked Yuwan to catch it. He was surprised that instead of finding a path, she found a monster first. Suddenly, Yuwan noticed something too, but it didn't look like a monster. It looked more like a system glitch. Perhaps their last run was starting to repeat itself, they thought. Enslave assumed it looked like a secret passage like the one on the 1st floor, but Yuwan said it was something else. It looked like it was about to break, making an unpleasant cracking and distortion, and at that moment, Russell lunged at what she thought was a monster. Without thinking, she hit it, and the unknown object disappeared. At this point, a window with a code appeared in front of Yuwan, saying that he had opened an unknown glitch that had the new concepts of malfunction and inversion. As the young man expected, it was a glitch phenomenon. When the signal is disrupted, both the image and sound are distorted, and inversion adds an alarm effect at the moment the monster appears. Since this type was completely different from any monster he had encountered before, completely unfamiliar concepts were being displayed here. Yuwan tried to understand how malfunction and inversion interacted with each other. And while he was deep in thought, one of the monsters attacked him. Fortunately, Doyan managed to react in time and destroyed the threat. She reminded that one needs to be more attentive and keep moving. The path is difficult. One cannot stand still. Doyan also added that it was a mental-type monster, which usually doesn't appear on the 5th floor, but under these circumstances, nothing surprises her anymore. While they were running, Yuwan continued to accumulate inversion. Perhaps it would come in handy. Meanwhile, Rachel also continued to fight the monsters. Although she could still control herself, for some reason she couldn't stop. Yuwan said that she shouldn't fight alone, otherwise she would risk going berserk. Therefore, he noted that for now it would be better for her to stay close to him. Doyan continued to remind everyone to be alert and not get distracted by conversations. Yuwan decided not to try to absorb the concepts emerging from the walls of the labyrinth for now, putting it off until later. Right now he needed to focus on absorbing concepts from the glitches. Quite a lot of time had passed, but they continued to move along the route, as if in a circle. Doyan noted that it was indeed strange. She remembered every route she had taken, but despite the changed shape of the passages, this place seemed familiar. The thing was that this was not an ordinary labyrinth, but one that changed in real time. Therefore, according to Doyan, the only way is to destroy the labyrinth entirely. Her words gave Yuwan an interesting thought. The thing is, he was so busy collecting inversion that he missed something important. Just when Doyan was about to destroy the labyrinth, Yuwan asked her to wait a little. He explained that the constantly changing path made no sense, so there must be a hidden exit somewhere. Perhaps some kind of camouflage door right in the wall. His guesses turned out to be correct. The young man found a key hidden in the wall. Thanks to this, he absorbed the concept of illusion, which is inaccessible to ordinary people. The other side of the labyrinth opened up before them, another part of the room. The boys were surprised how Yuwan managed to find this. He admitted that he had noticed this place a long time ago, but was too focused on collecting concepts and ignored the discovery. However, Yuwan explained to his friends that he didn't like wasting time either, so after observing what was happening for a couple of hours, he found an area that seemed strange to him. This gave Doyan a certain thought. Yuwan had managed to find a magical vulnerability that even she hadn't noticed. As she expected, Yuwan is not just a genius, he is much more than that. Meanwhile, the group continued to move through the labyrinth, destroying magical vulnerabilities. This also paid off for Yuwan, as he continued to accumulate more and more valuable concepts. But there was one snag. The young man hit the ceiling. His magical power reached 199,999 and did not increase any further. Even though Yuwan had absorbed enough concepts, even more than necessary, his magical power still did not grow, unlike his life or body. Suddenly, Doyan crept up to him unnoticed. The young man was so immersed in his thoughts that he didn't notice her. She asked what was bothering him, and he replied that despite defeating an elite monster, his magic power was not increasing. Hearing this, Doyan laughed slightly, but Yuwan did not share her amusement. She explained that it was all because he had hit a wall. He absorbed energy, as if sucking it out of everything around him, but continued to water the plant, not giving it time to grow, which is why he quickly reached his limit. So trying to surpass the limit by blindly hunting monsters is not the best option right now. She noted that there is a more effective and efficient method that can help him. At that moment, she looked at Russell with suspicion, which scared her a little. Doyan said that instead of hanging around campus on weekends, it was better to breathe fresh air, eat delicious food, and go shopping, hinting that while she and Yuwan were having fun, she continued studying. But Yuwan asked her to tell him about this method, promising in exchange to consider going out to eat or shopping with her. Doyan agreed and noted that it would take time. The best thing he could do now was to learn the basics of the divine manifestation art Hyunsingon. Despite its big name, this is just a basic martial art and won't be too difficult. Until now, Yuwan had only learned the principles from Doyan, but had never directly practiced martial arts. Was this really where he would be trained? Yuwan asked if he shouldn't at least go through a formal apprenticeship ceremony or something. Doyan replied that this was just basic internal training that even children learned, so it was better for them to prepare. She was surprised by Yuwan's words. After all, he was a person from another world, but he was talking about a formal apprenticeship ceremony. She pretended that it didn't mean anything, although in fact, the art of divine manifestation is not a martial art that can be taught simply by wishing. It was a secret technique that was strictly passed down through generations, and if her father knew about it, he would be quite shocked. After all, they met only recently. He is a stranger from another world, and she is already passing on the family equipment to him. Yuwan was already ready, but he didn't understand why he needed to undress. Doyan herself could not imagine that one day she would pass on the secret art, meant only for the descendants of her line, to someone like Yuwan. Therefore, if she tells anyone about it, it will be only when he becomes her husband. But since she had agreed, she had to see it through to the end. Doyan told Yuwan to sit up straight and calm his mind. From the moment they met, she had a strange feeling growing in her, a desire to raise this person with her own hands. Yuwan was different from anyone she had met before. His talent in martial arts was undeniable, but his potential was even more impressive. If such a person develops systematically, it will be interesting to see how quickly and far he can advance. These thoughts haunted Doyan, and at the same time, she didn't want anyone other than her to influence his potential. She herself did not understand what it was about him that made her experience such feelings, but now was not the time to be distracted by such thoughts. She asked Yuwan again if he was ready. Yuwan asked if before starting, shouldn't Doyan recite a mantra or some sort of introductory speech, explaining the technique, its name, essence, and application. This made Doyan laugh. She replied that even if he read it, he would not be able to understand it. It would be easier to implant it into his body right away. But regarding the apprenticeship ceremony, she became curious about where Yuwan got such knowledge of martial arts. But Yuwan refrained from answering. After all, if he said that he had read too many martial arts novels, Doyan would definitely beat him up. She warned that she was starting the process. Yuwan wanted to say something, but it was too late. The divine manifestation technique that Doyan was going to teach him would completely change the nature of his ki, mana, and body. The body will continuously absorb magical power, creating pure ki, and since the body and mana are trained simultaneously, their capacity will increase naturally. Roughly speaking, you filter magical power and turn it into pure ki. When Doyan touched Yuwan, it felt like a fireball had burst into him. It felt like it was madly devouring mana and moving throughout my entire body. It was as if he was paving a path where none had existed before. Yuwan began to worry that his body would burn out from all this energy. But Doyan told him to calm down, explaining that burning one's way inside the body, constantly moving divine ki, is the basis of divine manifestation. Once he completes his training, the path ahead will be revealed to him. The blue flames continuously moved inside Yuwan's body. Over time, he began to feel much better and realized that using mana directly was not always the best choice. He also obtained a new martial arts concept called divine manifestation and reached the 20th level of understanding. Thanks to this, some negative concepts in his body were eliminated, and the excess positive potential accelerated the development of others. As Doyan had said, the concepts in his body were gradually replaced by divine ki. The more he trained, the more he felt himself growing. Yuwan thanked Doyan and asked what gift she wanted in return. She replied with a smile that she was looking forward to it and would definitely think about it. In the meantime, he better wipe off the sweat if he doesn't want to conquer the tower alone. Yuwan felt a strange feeling. If he concentrated a little more, he might be able to sense the circulation of divine ki. The more filtered ki passed through the body, the stronger the body became, and the sharper the senses. Yuwan never imagined that such an effective martial art would come his way for free. Enslave asked if he was going to upload a video of the process, but Yuwan replied that of course not. Doyan asked why, which made Yuwan a little nervous. The guys started joking that such a video would get a ton of views, but Yuwan just said that there would definitely be no such thing on their channel. Enslave offered his friends a bite to eat since they had been wandering around the floor for quite some time, but Doyan replied that she was against it. They had already stayed on the 5th floor for too long, so they could forget about food until they got to the 6th. And suddenly they managed to see something that looked like an exit. It was a huge door. Perhaps the entrance to the next room was hidden behind it. Enslave assumed that the road to the 6th level should be behind this door, but Yuwan had his doubts. He asked his friends not to rush into a decision and give him a second to think. Yuwan felt like something strange was going on and that there was something wrong with this door. Using his eyes, he noticed the dim traces of another concept. Yuwan didn't immediately understand where they were leading, inside the door or outside it. Although the situation was tense, Yuwan became curious and stepped forward first. He didn't explain anything to the others, so they decided to follow him. At first glance, there was nothing behind the door. It looked like just a wall. Enslave suggested that perhaps they had gone the wrong way. At first it seemed that way. But if you looked closely, you could see something. With his eyes, Yuwan noticed many concepts on the wall. The wall was densely filled with illusions. Yuwan decided to touch the illusions. Maybe something would happen. And so it happened. He destroyed the concepts of illusion and opened a new passage. The guys were surprised and didn't understand what it was, but it was obvious. This was a new exit. Doyan noted that this appears to be a shortcut. After breaking the wall of illusions, Yuwan absorbed 50 concepts. This was incredible because before he had only collected 0.1. He was glad that he had managed to find such a well-hidden secret path. Yuwan asked the others what they would do now that they had found the shortest route. Perhaps the shortcut is actually more dangerous than the usual one, but the boys cast aside their doubts and ran towards the new path at once. 50 illusion concepts Yuwan decided to feed to Ava to make her even stronger. The shortest path didn't look like a normal road. It was a long staircase that went straight up. Yuwan guessed that maybe the room was changing as they climbed, but there was no separate shift. Doyan said that maybe the staircase was the shift. Russell noted that Kulam indicated that they were now on the 8th floor. Yuwan was surprised that the path was so short. They managed to skip 3 rooms at once. Eslight remembered that the handbook had said this. A shortcut was a great success, but the more rooms they passed, the more difficult the one they got to would be, although the reward for it was higher. However, Eslight still remained worried and asked that next time they avoid shortcuts. Yuwan didn't understand why he was so scared. This wasn't the case last time. Moreover, he seemed less mentally stable, constantly thinking about his sword. Doyan continued to chide Eslight for relying too much on the sword. Perhaps it would be better if she broke it. At this point, Yuwan and Russell seemed to have found a way out. At the end of the climb, there was something that looked like a door. Had they finally reached the exit? Since the pendant showed the 8th level, the 9th should be waiting for them behind this door. Russell advised Yuwan to be careful after sensing hostility outside the door. It was just like that time when she had the feeling of a monster's presence. Doyan agreed that it wouldn't hurt to be careful, and added that when they got up, Eslight could draw her sword. Eslight was so happy about this that without a second thought, he rushed to be the first to look at the next floor. This floor was again different from those they had visited. There were no monsters or high ceilings here, so Eslight assumed they were in a recreation area. But Yuwan doubted it. There was no mention of a rest area anywhere. Meanwhile, a stranger was hiding behind one of the columns. He suddenly used his power and fired straight at the group. A flying ball, similar to a bullet bomb, headed towards Doyan. Doyan was surprised to see this, not immediately understanding what had happened. There was a powerful explosion. The guys were worried if everything was okay with her. Doyan managed to stop the attack and asked Yuwan what it was, since it was said before that no one except him could use the weapons in the tower. Yuwan guessed that the enemy's weapon might be disposable. Using his eyes, he easily found the enemy, who attacked them from behind. He ordered Eslight to run after the attacker and catch him. The stranger did not immediately understand that he had been identified and how Yuwan had found his hiding place. He was sure that his stealth skill should not be determined by newcomers, but at that moment, Eslight pierced him with a sword. It confused him, but he still hoped that the situation was under control. Initially, he wanted to remove Eslight and then destroy the entire group. Yuwan asked if Doyan was okay, noting that if the shot had hit someone else, it could have been dangerous. He also noticed that it was not an ordinary projectile at all. Right now, Doyan had her foot on a magic bomb, and a very powerful one at that, but Yuwan managed to defuse it. Meanwhile, the battle between Eslight and the unknown enemy continued. Eslight struck, not giving the enemy a chance to counterattack. While he was losing his guard, Yuwan threw his own bomb at him. When the stranger reached for the detonation button, everything turned against him. He was shocked to see his own bomb right above his head. He expected an explosion, but was very surprised when the bomb did not explode after bouncing off the column. But one way or another, he no longer had time for surprise. After all, despite this, his main opponent was still Eslight, and for his loss of vigilance he paid with his life. Eslight asked why he attacked them and how he ended up here. Yuwan also approached them and asked if, after he had identified him, he still didn't realize that he had bombs in his shells. The enemy relied too much on his skills and ended up getting caught. But the stranger did not answer, but on the contrary, began to ask them who they were. He was also curious about what a strong rookie like Yuwan was doing on the lower floors. After his sharp outburst, a magic projectile from Doyan flew at him. He couldn't even imagine what kind of trouble he got into, thinking that it would be easy to deal with them. Doyan said that before they could discuss everything peacefully, she would rather break his arms and legs so that he wouldn't do anything stupid. Meanwhile, anger at the stranger also gripped the seemingly calm Russell. Giving in to negative emotions, she began to go into berserker mode and said that if they didn't kill this guy, he would kill them. She lunged at him without warning, but fortunately, Yuwan managed to stop her with his magic chains. But even so, Russell continued to be aggressive and ignore Yuwan's words. Suddenly, a strange and frightening voice began to be heard from somewhere. The voice said that one of them had failed their mission, and apparently, this voice was addressing the stranger. He continued that, given the situation, it looked like this guy's role had come to an end. He tried to object that he could still be useful, but at that moment something strange began to happen to his body. The voice continued to say that by sacrificing himself, he would earn the share of his comrades. It looked like this guy was about to explode, and Yuwan ordered everyone to move away. The voice still spoke of sacrifice, despite the stranger's pleas for another chance. And at that moment his body was compressed so strongly from the inside that it literally exploded, and the radius of the explosion was not small. The explosion resembled a bomb detonating, as if there really was something inside the guy. In the last seconds, Yuwan managed to escape the powerful explosion. It even seemed to him that for a moment he saw a river of dead people, as if he already had one foot there. If I hadn't had time to react, I would have truly become a part of it. Realizing that he couldn't dodge in time and was caught in the blast radius, Yuwan decided to use the concept of a magic bomb. He was able to stop the explosion with another explosion, and if he had been even a second late, the consequences would have been catastrophic. S-Light was curious about what happened to that guy. Yuwan only replied that he must be fine and returned to the first level of the tower. But suddenly the same mysterious voice spoke again, stating that the boy was already dead, as the will of the tower had interpreted his act as a kill in combat. In essence, it was the same as if they had killed him themselves. Yuwan replied that this was nonsense, since it was this voice that pushed him to his death. The voice continued to talk about the sacrifice and how they had lost a valuable comrade without receiving anything in return. And now they should be more careful because the tower had begun to favor them. Yuwan didn't understand what he was talking about and decided to ask him directly, who is he? And also who that guy really was, and why he tried to kill them. An unfamiliar voice replied that they were Exodus, adding that even though they were enemies, they would not mind meeting them again. The boys were surprised by the sudden turn of events in the tower. Russell noted that unlike the previous constellation, this one at least gave its name. However, S-Light corrected that it was not a name, but the name of an organization. S-Light added that Exodus is the most famous pirate group in all dimensions. Most likely, some constellation patronizes them. The boys realized that these were the very pirates Professor Yumina had spoken of, and this worried them. Not only had they been met by a constellation, but now pirates were hunting them. Doyan noted that they were bound to encounter them anyway, so it was better to continue climbing higher and becoming stronger. But S-Light asked if they didn't find it strange that the constellation had just mentioned that the tower treated them specially. He noted that the constellation thus confirmed their guesses about the tower. Doesn't anyone feel strange? At that moment, S-Light, Russell, and Doyan received a notification. They looked at him strangely, so Yuwan asked what happened. He was worried that it was another letter from the director, but Doyan replied that it was not quite like that. It was a letter about leveling up and the corresponding rewards, and it came to everyone except Yuwan. Doyan noted that this was her first level up since joining. It was probably after they survived the constellation attack. S-Light was also surprised, but unlike the joyful Doyan, it made him nervous and, to some extent, irritated. And Russell was simply happy that her stats had increased. Yuwan was amazed because their stats were already off the charts, and now they had risen even higher. He couldn't understand why he was the only one left without a reward. Was it because he didn't have a status window? He refused to believe it because he also wanted to receive his reward. While looking at the explosion site, Yuwan noticed something strange, something that resembled a concept. But this concept looked different from those he had seen before. Rather, it looked like a line of text, so Yuwan decided that he could absorb it. After all, since everyone received their awards, it means he has the right too. As he absorbed the concept, he felt a strange feeling, unlike any he had experienced before. His body began to change and his stats increased noticeably. Along with this, he discovered two new concepts, myriad forms and stigmata. In simple terms, the myriad forms is the ultimate concept of transformation, and the stigmata are probably related to the constellations. Since he now had an improved form of transformation, Yuwan decided to test it out. He asked Eva if she was okay with the concept, and she of course agreed. Besides, as Yuwan noted, there is no point in holding on to concepts that he himself cannot use. However, as soon as Eva absorbed the concept, something strange began to happen to her, which greatly frightened Yuwan. The other boys turned around at his cry and asked him what happened. Turning around, they saw Yuwan holding Eva, who had somehow turned into an egg. She had acquired the form of a subject because she had a lower conceptual principle, which led to mutation. Yuwan noted that this had happened before, but then she hatched immediately after her transformation. This time, no. Doyan suggested that perhaps she had also leveled up, but Yuwan was still worried. But it seems they found a great way to calm Russell down if something happens. S-Light said that the next room was the restroom and suggested that they go there. Perhaps Eva would wake up by then. The recreation room was very different from the others. It was not just an empty room, but something more. The famous 10th room, which many have only heard about. S-Light reminded that if the tower's conquerors were unlucky, there would be no food or water here. But it seems they were very lucky to stumble upon such a beautiful garden. The room turned out to be a garden where the trees grew fruits called fruits of Eden. They relieved fatigue and increased stamina. Plus, they tasted absolutely amazing and were incredibly sweet. Yuwan remarked that he had never tasted anything so delicious before. Doyan agreed, adding that she had never tasted anything so sweet either, and she felt like her energy had increased a bit. She suggested eating all the fruit before moving on, but Enslave objected that it was pointless, since the effect only worked from one fruit. Yuwan still wanted to find some way to take a couple of fruits with him, but he didn't yet understand how. Suddenly, a code window appeared in front of him, informing him that he had eaten the one and only fruit of Eden, the fruit of evil, and now his eyes are able to discern sins. Yuwan didn't quite understand how he managed to get something like that just by eating a fruit that resembled a fig, and yet he became curious about the standards by which sin was defined here. Meanwhile, Russell called everyone over, asking them to look at the find. She found something that resembled a chest. Doyan guessed that this was probably a reward for their success. Even though it was apparently the lowest rank, there must be something unique inside. Yuwan agreed, adding that he felt like they had packed in all the challenges most teams would normally face into just one outing. He also remembered hearing about similar rewards. Each recreation area would contain a treasure to measure the progress made by the tower's climbers. They got a wooden chest with gold trim. It's probably a low grade, but the contents are high. Yuwan also noted that the treasures get better if the chest is bronze, silver, or gold. Enslave was already eager to open the chest and see what was inside, but Doyan stopped him. He didn't immediately understand why he couldn't open it, to which Doyan explained that it was Yuwan who had to open the chest. Doyan replied that Enslave was the unluckiest of them all, a sentiment that Russell agreed with. However, Enslave himself did not particularly like such statements. Yuwan himself was not against opening the chest, hoping that there would be something truly valuable inside. When they opened the chest, they experienced a wow effect, but alas, not in a good way. Inside lay an unknown object, resembling a scepter or a magic wand.